Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The first time I heard it, I dismissed it as the wind through the old ventilation system. A whisper, barely perceptible, yet somehow intimate in its familiarity. Sparky. No one had called me that in over 30 years. I stood frozen in my kitchen, coffee mug suspended halfway to my lips, listening to the silence that had swallowed the sound. The digital clock on the microwave blinked 3:17 a.m., its green glow the only light in the darkness. I'd been working late again, a habit that had earned me my corner office at Meridian Financial, but cost me a marriage. This house, a modernist monument of glass and steel perched on the edge of Blackwater Lake, was supposed to be my reward. Now, as I stared into the shadows pooling in the corners of my kitchen, I felt the first tremor of unease ripple through me. I told myself it was the stress of the merger, the 80-hour weeks, the Ambien I'd been taking to force sleep. My rational mind offered a dozen explanations, each more plausible than acknowledging I'd heard a childhood nickname whispered by an empty house. I drained my coffee and shuffled back to my office, determined to finish reviewing the quarterly projections before dawn. 3 days passed without incident. I settled into the rhythms of the house, learning its sounds, the expansion and contraction of new materials, the hum of high-end appliances, the whisper of the lake wind against the windows. I convinced myself that night had been an anomaly, a brief hallucination born of exhaustion and too much caffeine, until I found the baseball card. It was tucked between the pages of the Wall Street Journal I'd brought in from the driveway that morning. Mickey Mantle, 1956. Tops. Not just any card, but my card. The one with the bent corner and faint blue ink stain on the reverse where my uncle had started to write my name before thinking better of it. The card I'd traded away in the summer of 1988. I recognized it instantly, my fingers trembling as they traced the familiar damage. My throat constricted as I struggled to breathe, a cold weight settling in my stomach. This wasn't possible. This card should be halfway across the country, in the hands of Bobby Winters, who'd traded me his prized fossil collection for it. A collection that had sparked my brief but intense childhood fascination with paleontology. I dropped the card as though it had burned me, watching it flutter to the imported marble floor. My heart hammered against my ribs, a rhythm of panic I hadn't felt since the '08 crash when I'd nearly lost everything. There was no rational explanation for this, no logical path that led to this artifact from my past appearing in my newspaper. That night, I double-checked every lock, activated every section of the state-of-the-art security system that had been a non-negotiable feature of the purchase. I poured 3 fingers of Macallan 25, hoping it would dull the creeping dread that had settled over me. As I raised the glass to my lips, I caught movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow sliding across the wall where no shadow should be. I turned sharply, whiskey sloshing over my hand, but there was nothing there, just the pristine white wall of my minimalist living room, decorated with a single abstract canvas that had cost more than my first car. "Losing your mind, old man," I muttered to myself, the sound of my own voice providing momentary comfort in the oppressive silence. But as the words left my lips, another voice answered, distant yet crystal clear. "Sparky, remember the oath." The whiskey glass shattered on the floor, my hands suddenly numb and unresponsive. The voice had come from everywhere and nowhere, seeping through the walls like toxic gas. I backed away, my heel crunching on broken crystal, until my spine pressed against the cold glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, Blackwater Lake was a sheet of obsidian, reflecting a waning moon. I felt exposed, watched from both within and without, my breath fogging the glass behind me as my lungs worked overtime. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice an octave higher than normal, stripped of the authority I'd cultivated over decades of boardroom battles. No answer came, but the temperature plummeted, my exhaled breath now clearly visible in the moonlight. The sophisticated climate control system showed 72 degrees on the wall panel, but my skin prickled with goose flesh, a deep chill settling into my marrow. I spent that night with every light ablaze, sitting rigid in a leather armchair, a golf club clutched in white-knuckled hands. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was an elaborate prank, perhaps orchestrated by rivals at the firm, or disgruntled employees affected by the latest round of strategic workforce reductions I'd overseen. I called a security company and scheduled a full sweep for surveillance devices. They found nothing. The next day brought the photograph, curled and yellowed with age, tucked into my briefcase between financial reports. Me at 13, standing before a crude structure of sticks and stones in the woods behind my childhood home. My hands were bloody in the image, though I couldn't recall why. I was smiling, but there was something wrong with my eyes. They reflected the camera flash like those of a nocturnal animal. Behind me, partially obscured by shadow, was something I couldn't quite make out. A shape, tall and impossibly thin, with elongated fingers resting on my shoulder. A shape I'd convinced myself I'd invented. My head throbbed as suppressed memories threatened to surface. The woods, the abandoned well, the voice from the darkness that had offered to make me special, make me successful, if only I would promise something in return. A promise made with childish solemnity, sealed with blood from a palm sliced with a rusty pocket knife. A promise I'd buried so deeply in my psyche that it had become just another childhood fantasy, indistinguishable from imaginary friends and backyard adventures. I burned the photograph in my kitchen sink, watching the flames consume the image, expecting to feel relief. Instead, the smoke seemed to coalesce, hanging in the air longer than it should have, forming shapes that my mind struggled to interpret. When I finally waved it away, opening windows despite the autumn chill, I noticed my reflection in the window glass, gaunt, haggard, eyes sunken with exhaustion and fear. Behind my reflection, for just an instant, I saw another face, ancient and hungry. I didn't go to work the next day, or the day after. I stopped answering calls. The house began to feel like a living thing, breathing around me, watching me with unseen eyes. The walls seemed to pulse with a subtle rhythm, like a massive heart beating just out of sync with my own. I found more artifacts scattered throughout the house. A pocket knife with my initials carved clumsily into the handle, a torn page from a book of folklore I'd checked out repeatedly from the library, a smooth river stone I'd once believed was magical because of its perfect oval shape and the strange symbols that seemed to appear on its surface when wet. The whispers multiplied, no longer just my childhood nickname, but a chorus of voices speaking words I could almost but not quite understand. They emanated from heating vents, from drain pipes, from the spaces between floorboards. The voices were insistent, urgent, their unintelligible demands creating a constant background noise that made concentration impossible. Only two words came through with clarity, repeated with increasing frequency. Blood oath. I tried to leave once. Packed a bag, stumbled to my Tesla parked in the garage. The engine wouldn't start. Neither would my phone. The landline was dead. I considered walking out, hiking to the main road 3 miles away. But when I opened the front door, I found only a solid wall of impenetrable darkness. Not night, not fog, but an absolute void that roiled and shifted like something alive. I slammed the door, sliding down against it until I sat on the floor, head in my hands. Terror, a metallic taste on my tongue. The dreams began that night. Dreams of the ritual, of the entity I'd encountered as a young boy, drawn to it through a combination of loneliness, ambition, and the reckless courage of youth. In the dreams, I saw what I had promised in exchange for my future success. Upon reaching the apex of my achievement, I would complete a second ritual, one that would open a doorway. I hadn't understood then what kind of doorway, or what might come through it. Now, as the memories returned with brutal clarity, I understood all too well. I found the instructions the following morning, scrawled in my own childish handwriting on the back of my Harvard Business School diploma, which had been taken from my office wall and placed on my bed while I slept. The requirements were specific and bizarre, Symbols to be drawn, words to be spoken, and yes, blood to be offered. The final line chilled me to the core. Then he shall come through, and the oath will be fulfilled. The rational part of my brain, the part that had navigated complex financial regulations and orchestrated billion-dollar deals, screamed that this was madness. I was having a psychotic break, or being drugged, or experiencing some complex hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. But deeper, older instincts recognized the truth. I had made a bargain as a child, and the time had come to pay. For days I resisted. I tried to outlast it, to outthink it. I went without sleep until I collapsed from exhaustion, only to wake to new artifacts, new manifestations. The walls began to bleed a black, viscous substance that evaporated when touched. The rooms rearranged themselves when I wasn't looking, so that doors led to unexpected places and familiar hallways stretched into impossible geometries. Time itself became unreliable. My watch might show hours passing in minutes, or minutes stretching into days. The boundaries between this world and somewhere else were growing thin. It was the mirror that broke me. Not its shattering, but what I saw in it on the 7th day of my ordeal. My reflection hadn't been my own for some time, always slightly out of sync, smiling when I frowned, reaching for things I wasn't touching. But that morning, it showed me two futures with perfect clarity. One where I completed the ritual, and one where I continued to resist. Both were horrifying in their own ways, but only one left anything recognizable of the world I knew. I understood then that this was not about me. The entity had used me, yes, used my ambition, my drive, my willingness to sacrifice anything for success. But the price was far higher than just my soul. What waited on the other side of that doorway wanted entry to this world, and I had unwittingly agreed to be its usher. That night, as the voices reached a fevered pitch and the walls of my beautiful home rippled like water, I made my decision. I gathered the artifacts that had appeared, the baseball card, the knife, the stone, and a dozen other fragments of my past. I placed them in the center of the living room, arranging them in the pattern described in the instructions. I spoke the words, ancient syllables that felt like broken glass in my mouth. Then, instead of offering my blood to complete the ritual, I did the one thing the entity hadn't anticipated. I changed the terms of our agreement. I can't explain how I knew it would work. Perhaps some vestige of knowledge from that first encounter, or perhaps simple desperation. But I understood with sudden clarity that while such entities are bound by the exact words of a bargain, the interpretation of those words can be fluid. I had promised to open a doorway, yes, but I hadn't specified where that doorway would lead. As the air in the center of the circle began to shimmer and distort, I focused every ounce of my will on a different destination. Not our world, but the void I had glimpsed outside my door. The space between spaces, a prison rather than a gateway. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. A howl of rage tore through the house, shattering every window and light bulb simultaneously. The floor beneath the artifacts cracked open, revealing not the concrete foundation, but a swirling abyss. The pull was tremendous, a vortex that dragged at the fabric of reality itself. I was thrown against the wall, pinned there by forces beyond physics as the entity, now partially materialized as a writhing mass of shadows and angles that hurt the eyes to perceive, was sucked toward the opening. Its resistance was tremendous. The house groaned around us, timbers splitting, glass melting, the very air electrified with its fury. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we were locked in stalemate. The portal pulling, the entity resisting, myself caught in between. In that frozen moment, it spoke directly into my mind, promising new bargains, threatening cosmic retribution, offering knowledge beyond human comprehension. I closed my eyes and whispered a single word, a name I hadn't spoken since that summer day 30 years ago. Not my nickname, but the entity's true name, given in a moment of careless pride during our first encounter. The name I had carefully omitted from my childhood memories, along with everything else. The effect was like a thunderclap without sound. When I opened my eyes, the portal was gone. The artifacts were gone. The damage to the house remained. Broken windows, cracked floors, walls warped beyond repair. But the presence, the whispers, the distortions in reality, all had vanished as though they had never been. I stood in the ruins of my perfect house, my body shaking with exhaustion and residual terror. Outside, through the shattered windows, I could see Blackwater Lake reflecting the first light of dawn. The world looked solid again, real and ordinary in the growing light. I knew it wouldn't last. Such entities don't surrender easily, and while I had won this encounter, I had no illusions that it was gone forever. But I had bought time and understanding. I left the house that morning with nothing but the clothes on my back and the knowledge in my head. I didn't look back as I walked down the long driveway toward the main road. Some prices are too high, no matter what's offered in return. Some debts can't be paid without losing something essential. I don't know what will happen when the entity finds another way to reach me, through another bargain, another ritual, another door left carelessly open. But next time I'll be ready. Some promises are meant to be broken. Story 2. There's a moment when you realize your house no longer belongs to you. It happens quietly, a doorknob turning when no one is there, the subtle click of a latch releasing somewhere in the empty hallway. That's how it began for me. Small disturbances at the periphery of awareness, too easily dismissed as settling foundations or old pipes expanding. But houses don't reach for you. Houses don't breathe. And houses certainly don't hunger. At least that's what I believed before I broke through the walls. I've lived in this Victorian for 15 years. My sanctuary, my refuge from the world. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a study where I spent most evenings, all arranged in a logical floor plan I could navigate blindfolded. Each creaking floorboard was familiar, each drafty corner known, or so I thought. The first incident occurred on a Tuesday evening in late October. I was alone in my study, the radiator clanking as it fought against the autumn chill. The noise drew my attention to the hallway, where I glimpsed the brass doorknob of my bedroom slowly rotating clockwise. My breath caught in my throat. I watched, paralyzed, as it completed a full turn before stopping. No door opened. No one entered or exited. Just the silent, deliberate rotation of metal that should have remained still. I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, or perhaps a mechanical anomaly caused by temperature changes. The house was old after all. But the next night it happened again. Then again. Each time, different doorknobs throughout the house. Sometimes turning completely, sometimes just jiggling slightly, as if someone on the other side was testing whether the door was locked. My logical mind grasped for explanations, even as my skin prickled with goosebumps every time I passed a door. I began avoiding looking at doorknobs altogether, averting my eyes when moving from room to room. The contractor I hired to check the house found nothing unusual. He suggested maybe the old hardware was just loose, and the slight tilt of the floors, common in aging houses, might be causing the mechanisms to turn. So I decided to renovate, starting with the upstairs bathroom, which had always been too small and outdated anyway. The contractor removed the old fixtures, tore down the moldy drywall, and exposed the framework. That's when I first noticed something odd about the dimensions. The bathroom was narrower inside than it should have been, given the exterior measurements of the house. The contractor shrugged it off as typical for old construction. Nothing was ever square or properly measured, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was space unaccounted for. Space hiding behind the walls. The renovation was completed in 2 weeks. New tiles, new fixtures, fresh paint. I should have felt satisfied. Instead, a new unease settled over me. The bathroom felt wrong somehow. Not just unfamiliar, but fundamentally incorrect, as if it had been assembled slightly out of alignment with reality. That night, I woke to the sound of rushing water. Stumbling to the bathroom in the dark, I found the faucet running at full blast, the water nearly overflowing from the sink. I hadn't used the sink before going to bed. I was certain of it. My hands trembled as I turned off the water, and when I looked up into the mirror, my reflection seemed delayed by a fraction of a second, as if struggling to catch up with my movements. I backed out of the bathroom, my heart hammering against my ribs. As I turned to head back to bed, I noticed the bathroom door hadn't been fully closed. It swung open wider, revealing not the hallway I expected, but a corridor I had never seen before, dimly lit by what appeared to be gas lamps along the walls. My throat constricted. Sweat beaded across my forehead as I stared into this impossible space. The corridor stretched at least 30 feet, far beyond where the exterior wall of my house should have been. The wallpaper was an ancient floral pattern I had never selected. The floorboards were wider, darker, and worn in different places than my own. I shut the door firmly, pressing my back against it, breathing in ragged gasps. When I finally gathered the courage to open it again, the familiar hallway of my house had returned. I convinced myself it had been a vivid dream, the product of stress and an overactive imagination triggered by the renovation. But the next night, it happened again. This time, when I opened my bedroom door intending to go downstairs for a glass of water, I found myself looking into a version of my living room that wasn't mine. The furniture was arranged differently. The colors were wrong, all deep reds and browns instead of the blues and grays I had chosen. And worst of all, there was someone sitting in the armchair by the fireplace. Someone with my face, but not quite right. The eyes too wide, the smile stretched too far across features that seemed subtly elongated. I slammed the door shut, my body shaking uncontrollably. Cold sweat soaked through my t-shirt. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening for movement on the other side. Nothing. When I finally worked up the nerve to open it again, my normal upstairs hallway had returned. I began to map these anomalies. They seemed to center around the renovated bathroom but were spreading. Certain times of day were worse than others. The hour just before dawn, and again at dusk, when the light was uncertain. Sometimes doors would open to where they should, and sometimes to elsewhere. I started carrying a notebook, documenting which doors led to which impossible spaces at what times. I developed a system, testing each door before fully committing to step through. My research revealed patterns. The dining room door, when opened between 3:17 a.m. and 3:42 a.m., led to a version of my dining room where everything was covered in dust and cobwebs, as if abandoned for decades. The front door, if opened precisely at sunset, revealed not my porch, but an endless hallway lined with identical doors. The basement door sometimes opened onto a cavernous space filled with machinery I didn't recognize, tended by figures who moved too quickly to properly see. And everywhere, in every alternate space, I would catch glimpses of the others, the not quite right versions of people I knew. My neighbor with eyes that reflected light like a cat's. My ex-wife, her movements too fluid, as if her joints bent in places human joints shouldn't. My brother speaking in a voice that seemed to emanate not from his mouth, but from somewhere behind him. I began to understand that my house existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, that the renovation had somehow damaged the barriers between these realities, that doors were not just passages between rooms, but between worlds. I consulted specialists, architects, structural engineers, even a self-proclaimed paranormal expert. I described the phenomenon in vague terms to avoid sounding insane. The most helpful was an elderly professor of theoretical physics, who spoke of multiverse theory and quantum superposition. He suggested, hypothetically of course, that spaces could exist in multiple states simultaneously until observed, just like subatomic particles. That perhaps old houses, having been observed for so long by so many different observers, might develop thin spots between dimensional planes. I didn't tell him that the entities in these other dimensions had begun to notice me watching them. The first time one of them acknowledged my presence, I had been observing a version of my kitchen where all the proportions were slightly wrong. The counters too high, the doorways too narrow. A figure that resembled my father, who had moved to Florida years ago, stood at the sink, his back to me. Suddenly, he went rigid. Then, slowly, he turned. His eyes, when they met mine, were completely black. His mouth opened in what might have been a smile or a grimace, revealing too many teeth. He raised one hand in greeting, then pointed directly at me before making a beckoning gesture. I retreated, slamming the door shut, my lungs burning as I realized I'd been holding my breath. But something had changed. They knew I was watching now. And worse, they seemed increasingly able to affect my reality. Objects began to move when I wasn't looking. I'd set down my coffee mug and find it across the room seconds later. I'd wake to find furniture rearranged. The doorknobs now turned constantly, even when I was staring directly at them. Doors would swing open by themselves, revealing glimpses of those other spaces before slamming shut again. The boundaries were weakening. I could feel it. Sometimes I'd be sitting in my living room and suddenly the wallpaper would ripple, briefly revealing that other pattern underneath before settling back to normal. Sometimes the floor would seem to shift beneath my feet, as if the house itself was breathing. I began hearing voices from inside the walls, muffled conversations in languages I didn't recognize, punctuated by laughter that sounded almost, but not quite, human. I considered abandoning the house, but something told me the phenomenon would follow me. That once the connection had been established, distance wouldn't matter. Besides, I had nowhere else to go. And part of me, a part I didn't want to acknowledge, had grown fascinated by these other dimensions, these other versions of reality layered atop my own. One night, after weeks of deteriorating conditions, I made a decision. Instead of continuing to document and avoid these anomalies, I would confront them directly. I would step fully through one of these doorways and explore what lay beyond. I chose the bathroom door, where it had all started. I waited until 3:33 a.m., the time when, according to my notes, the phenomena were strongest. I stood before the door, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. Sweat trickled down my spine despite the chill in the air. I grasped the doorknob, which felt unnaturally cold, and turned it. The door swung open to reveal not my bathroom, but a vast cathedral-like space impossibly contained within the dimensions of my house. The ceiling soared at least 30 feet high, supported by columns that looked like they were made of bone. The floor was tiled in a complex geometric pattern that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally. And at the center of the room stood what appeared to be a scale model of my house. Every detail perfect, down to the color of the curtains and the crack in the front step. Surrounding this model were figures, dozens of them. Some resembled people I knew, others were strangers, and still others barely looked human at all. Their proportions wrong, their features fluid and unstable. They all turned to look at me as I entered, their movements synchronized as if choreographed. One stepped forward, a version of me, but older, with gray hair and deeply lined face. His eyes, unlike the others, appeared normal, almost kind. He gestured toward the model house. In a voice that sounded like mine, but distorted, as if speaking through water, he explained what I had already begun to suspect. That reality was not singular but multiple. That certain locations, like my house, existed as nexus points between dimensions. That the renovation had damaged the barriers, allowing bleed-through between worlds that should remain separate. He didn't speak these words directly. Rather, I understood them as impressions forming in my mind as he gestured toward the model. He showed me how each room in the house connected to a different dimensional plane, how entities from these other realities had become aware of the weakening boundaries and were attempting to cross over. Some, he implied, had benign intentions. Others did not. I asked, my voice barely a whisper, if the damage could be repaired. The response came not from my doppelganger, but from the assembled crowd, a susurration of voices that merged into one. They explained that the barriers could be reinforced, but it would require understanding and acceptance of these other realities. That by acknowledging their existence, by learning to navigate between them consciously, rather than accidentally, I could help restore the natural separation. The alternative, they warned, was complete collapse. The merging of all possible versions of my house, and perhaps beyond. Reality itself unraveling from this central point of weakness. I returned to my dimension with new purpose. Over the subsequent weeks, I learned to control the passages, to open doors intentionally to specific realities, and to close them properly afterward. I reinforced the boundaries through rituals the others had taught me, burning specific herbs, marking symbols at thresholds, speaking words that didn't sound like they should be able to form in a human mouth. Gradually, the unintended manifestations subsided. Doorknobs stopped turning on their own. Rooms stopped shifting when I wasn't looking. The voices in the walls grew quieter, then silent. But I know they're still there. All those other versions of my house, my life, myself, existing simultaneously, separated by barriers thin as paper. Sometimes, late at night, I still feel the gentle pressure of those other realities pressing against mine, like fingers testing the strength of a membrane. I've made peace with it. This house that exists in multiple dimensions simultaneously. This home that is also a crossroads. I maintain the boundaries diligently, performing the necessary rituals at the prescribed times. I've even started renovating again, carefully, consciously, with respect for the spaces between walls. I live here with my other selves now, though they keep to their own dimensions. We've reached an understanding, a mutual non-interference pact. Sometimes I glimpse them through windows or mirrors, going about their lives that are almost, but not quite, like mine. And sometimes, when the light hits just right, I can see through the solid surfaces of my house to the complex, multidimensional structure that exists beneath perception. The true form of my home, extending in impossible directions through realities stacked like pages in a book. I no longer fear the turning doorknobs. Now I listen to what they're trying to tell me. Story 3. The first thing I noticed was the silence, not the usual comfortable silence of a home at rest, but the hollow, expectant quiet that seems to hold its breath, waiting. I should have recognized it then, the way time felt stretched and distorted in the corners of my home. But hindsight offers clarity that the present cruelly withholds. That night, surrounded by laughter and the warm glow of wine, I had no idea that reality was beginning to fracture around me, that time itself had developed a taste for moving backward. It was a Friday evening in late October when it began. I had invited 3 friends over for dinner, a simple gathering to break the monotony of my increasingly isolated existence since the separation. The meal had gone well. My cooking skills hadn't deteriorated as much as I'd feared. We sat around the dining table, glasses filled with a Cabernet I couldn't afford but had splurged on anyway, when the sound cut through our conversation like a blade. The crash was unmistakable, the distinctive crystalline shattering of glass against a hard surface. All 4 of us froze, conversation halting mid-sentence. My apartment wasn't large, and the sound had clearly come from the living room, not 10 yards from where we sat. Aaron raised an eyebrow, silently questioning if I was expecting anyone else. I wasn't. I pushed back from the table, a strange heaviness settling in my chest as I stood. My friends followed behind me as we moved cautiously toward the source of the noise. The short hallway between dining room and living area seemed unnaturally long, the air thicker than it should have been. My skin prickled with goosebumps despite the warm temperature. What we found made no sense. In the center of my living room carpet stood a wine glass, one from the set I'd been using for dinner. It stood perfectly upright on the beige carpet, completely intact, not a crack or chip visible. A perfect pristine glass where there should have been shards. None of us spoke for several seconds. I circled the glass cautiously, examining it from all angles. No liquid inside or around it, no signs of disturbance. Just a wine glass, standing impossibly on soft carpet, precisely where we had all heard something shatter. Sarah was the first to speak, suggesting a neighbor might have broken something. I knew immediately she was wrong. The sound had been too close, too present. But I nodded anyway, desperate for a rational explanation. We returned to dinner, but the conversation had shifted, become stilted and artificial. The incident hung between us like an uninvited guest. Within an hour, they had all made excuses to leave. Alone in my apartment, I returned to the living room and stared at the glass, still standing where we'd found it. I reached out, half expecting my hand to pass through it like a hologram, but my fingers met solid crystal. When I picked it up, it was ice cold to the touch despite the warm room. I nearly dropped it when I saw what was underneath, a small puddle of red wine, seemingly pressed upward into the bottom of the glass rather than spilled beneath it. An impossibility, a violation of physics. That night, lying in bed, I could hear my own heart beating, each thud painfully distinct in the quietness of my bedroom. Sleep evaded me as my mind replayed the incident, seeking explanations where none existed. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it again, the sound of breaking glass, this time from the kitchen. My body tensed, muscles coiling tight as I sat upright. Sweat had already formed on my forehead and upper lip, my breathing shallow and rapid. The darkness of my bedroom suddenly seemed malevolent, hiding things just beyond my perception. I fumbled for the lamp, nearly knocking it over before flooding the room with harsh yellow light. The journey to the kitchen was an exercise in controlled terror. Each step on the hardwood floor seemed to echo unnaturally, as if the sound were traveling backward to meet my foot rather than radiating outward. When I flipped on the kitchen light, I found my favorite coffee mug, the one I had accidentally knocked from the counter and shattered that morning, sitting perfectly intact beside the sink. I approached it slowly, my legs trembling so badly I had to steady myself against the counter. The mug was immaculate, without a single crack. More disturbing were the coffee stains around and inside it. They seemed to be moving, ever so slightly, flowing upward against the ceramic, rather than downward with gravity. When I touched the handle, images flashed through my mind. My own hand knocking the mug off the counter but backward, the shards flying up from the floor and reassembling in my grasp. I recoiled, a strangled gasp escaping my lips. My pulse hammered in my ears as I backed away from the counter. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. The following days brought escalating incidents. The bathroom mirror, which had been cracked for months after I'd slammed a cabinet door too hard, was suddenly flawless when I went to brush my teeth. As I stood before it, toothbrush frozen halfway to my mouth, I watched in horror as a spiderweb of cracks appeared and then disappeared in the glass, over and over, like a video playing in reverse and then forward again. My reflection remained static while the mirror itself seemed caught in a temporal loop. My hands shook so violently I couldn't hold the toothbrush. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to shock myself back to rationality. But when I looked up, the mirror showed not my face, but the bathroom from 3 months earlier. Different towels, different soap dispenser, even the paint a shade darker from before I'd redone it. For an instant, I saw movement behind me, a blur of familiar features, before the mirror snapped back to normal. By the end of the week, I had mapped out the affected areas of my apartment. The northwest corner of the living room, most of the kitchen, parts of the bathroom. These were places where time had become untethered, moving forward and backward like a tide. I avoided them when possible, but my apartment wasn't large enough to stay completely clear. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. Each time I drifted off, I would wake to find objects rearranged, not by someone breaking in, but by time itself, restoring things to where they had been days or weeks or months before. My throat was perpetually dry, my eyes burning from exhaustion. I began documenting everything, taking photos with my phone, trying to establish some objective record of what was happening. Most of the pictures came out blurred or distorted, but some captured the impossible. A broken plate reforming in midair, the pieces hovering above the floor, a tear in the sofa cushion sealing itself as I watched. What terrified me most were the glimpses, fragmentary visions of past events that played out around the restored objects. Standing in the kitchen, I would suddenly see translucent figures moving about. Myself, friends, occasionally my ex. These apparitions never acknowledged my presence. They were recordings, echoes of time, doubling back on itself. I hadn't told anyone what was happening. How could I? The words themselves seemed to disintegrate before I could form them. My friends texted, asking why I'd gone silent, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. What would I say? That time was unraveling in my apartment? That I was witnessing the past bleed into the present through broken things made whole again? 10 days after the initial incident, I realized the phenomenon was accelerating. The temporal anomalies were growing more frequent, more intense, and affecting larger areas of my apartment. The visions lasted longer, showed events from further back. Worse, I began to notice a pattern. The loops were contracting, showing the same events repeatedly but with less time between them. My past was folding in on itself, compressing like an accordion being squeezed by invisible hands. On the 12th day, I was in the bathroom when it happened. The most vivid episode yet. The mirror clouded over, not with steam, but with a milky opaqueness that seemed to swirl and pulse. My reflection disappeared, replaced by a clear view of the bathroom as it had been nearly a year ago. I could see myself standing at the sink, eyes red and swollen, a razor in hand as I contemplated shaving off the beard I'd grown during the darkest days after the separation. But this time, unlike the previous visions, the past version of me paused. His head tilted slightly, as if listening. Then slowly, deliberately, he turned toward me, toward the present, his eyes focusing on the exact spot where I stood watching. A jolt of pure terror surged through me. My heart slammed against my ribs as if trying to escape my chest. Past me opened his mouth to speak, and though no sound came through, I could read the words on his lips. "It's contracting." I fled the bathroom, a scream lodged in my throat. My entire body shook, cold sweat plastering my shirt to my back. The implication was clear and horrifying. Whatever was happening wasn't just affecting objects. It was affecting me. The loop was becoming aware of itself. Past and present were beginning to communicate. That night, I packed a bag. I needed to get out, to see if the phenomenon was tied to the apartment or to me. As I threw clothes haphazardly into a duffel, my hands trembling so badly I could barely zip it closed, the lights flickered. Not the usual electrical stutter, but a rhythmic pulsing that seemed synchronized with my heartbeat. The air grew thick, resistant, like moving through water. I made it as far as the front door before it happened. The biggest reversion yet. The entire apartment shifted around me. Furniture rearranged itself, paint changed color, objects appeared and disappeared. I stood frozen, watching months of time roll backward in seconds. When it stopped, the apartment looked exactly as it had the day I moved in after the separation. Empty except for the few boxes I'd brought with me. But I wasn't alone. There, in the center of the living room, stood another version of myself. Not a vision or apparition this time, but solid, real. I looked exhausted, eyes sunken, face gaunt. He wore the same clothes I had on, held the same duffel bag in his right hand. When our eyes met, I saw my own terror reflected back at me. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. I understood with sudden, crystalline clarity what was happening. Time wasn't just moving backward in isolated pockets. It was folding, collapsing. The loop I had feared wasn't a cycle, but a spiral, tightening with each iteration, bringing temporal versions of myself closer together with each contraction. The other me raised his hand slowly, reaching out. I mirrored the gesture, driven by some instinct beyond conscious thought. As our fingers neared each other, the air between us seemed to vibrate, to ripple like the surface of disturbed water. A high-pitched whine filled my ears, growing louder as our hands drew closer. The moment our fingers touched, everything stopped. The sound cut off abruptly. The apartment froze in mid-transition between past and present. Even the dust motes hanging in the air remained suspended, motionless. Then, like a tape being rewound at high speed, I experienced everything again, every moment since that dinner party, but backward. The terror, the discoveries, the isolation. I felt myself being pulled through my own timeline, experiencing my memories in reverse. But not just my memories, his as well. I saw cycles I hadn't lived yet, iterations of the loop where I had made different choices, spoken to different people about what was happening, even tried to document it scientifically. When the backward rush finally stopped, I found myself seated at my dining room table, surrounded by my 3 friends. The conversation flowed around me, ordinary and mundane. Sarah was in mid-sentence describing a work conflict I'd already heard about. Aaron was refilling his wine glass. Everything was exactly as it had been that first night. A cold certainty settled in my stomach. I knew what would happen next. The crash from the living room, the intact wine glass, the beginning of the loop. But knowledge creates possibility. As my friends continued talking, unaware of what was about to occur, I made a decision. When the sound came, and it would come, I was certain I wouldn't investigate. I would break the pattern. The minutes stretched painfully as I waited, my nerves stretched to breaking point. My hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white with tension. My friends noticed my distraction, exchanging concerned glances, but continued their conversation. Then it happened, the distinct sound of glass shattering in the living room. Everyone froze, looking toward the hallway, then back at me. Aaron raised his eyebrow in that familiar, questioning look. They expected me to lead them to investigate. Instead, I forced a smile, my facial muscles stiff with fear. "It's nothing," I said, the words tasting foreign on my tongue. "Just the neighbors. Let's continue." Confusion flickered across their faces, but after a moment of uncertainty, the conversation resumed. I participated mechanically, my attention divided between the present moment and the hallway leading to the living room. Part of me expected reality to fracture, to force me into the predetermined path. But nothing happened. Hours later, after my friends had gone, I stood at the entrance to the living room, heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't turned on the light, hadn't looked to see if the glass was there. Now, the moment of truth had arrived. I flicked on the light switch, flooding the room with harsh brightness. The carpet was empty. No wine glass stood impossibly upright on its surface. Relief washed over me in a dizzying wave. I had broken the loop, changed the pattern, escaped. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A small, dark stain on the beige carpet where the glass should have been. I knelt down, examining it closely. A perfect circle of red wine already drying at the edges. As I touched the stain with my fingertip, I felt it, cold, almost vibrating with potential energy. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty. The loop hadn't been broken. It had merely been reset. Time would try again, and again, until it got what it wanted. I'm still waiting to find out what that is. Story 4. I still remember the exact moment I first sensed that something was off. The fluorescent light in my bathroom flickered, casting the space in a pale, sickly glow that made my skin crawl. It was late, and the kind of heaviness that settles over a silent house pressed in around me. But there was something else in that air, an undercurrent of unease that I couldn't quite name. My eyes locked on a single black tile nestled among the glossy white ones on my newly renovated bathroom wall. It seemed to pulse under the light, as if it were trying to draw my attention. In that initial moment, I felt a surge of apprehension so strong that I almost turned around and fled. But I didn't. I took one step closer, my heart pounding in my ears, and that was the beginning of everything that followed. I had spent weeks supervising the renovation of my bathroom. I wanted a space that felt modern and sleek, with a touch of boldness. The contractor had shown me an array of standard white tiles, then suggested a contrasting black tile set randomly for a contemporary aesthetic. It seemed like a nice idea, visually striking, nothing more. But from the day the renovations ended, the entire bathroom felt wrong. At first, it was subtle. The lighting seemed too dim no matter how bright the bulbs were, and the air felt stale, as if it had been trapped there for decades. Sometimes the smell of wet concrete mingled strangely with a faint metallic tang that no amount of air freshener could eliminate. And always, there was that single black tile, perpetually drawing my attention, whether I wanted it or not. I started feeling compelled to look at it more closely each time I passed by the bathroom door. I'd peek in just to see it glinting dully in the gloom. It seemed to absorb the light around it, creating a small, distorted reflection of the bathroom and of me. Each day I found myself spending an extra second, then an extra minute, standing in front of it. The reflection in the tile never quite matched the rest of the room. The angles felt subtly skewed like a fisheye lens capturing the shapes. My own face looked slightly stretched, eyes wide, features too elongated. It was disturbing, but also impossible to ignore. I remember leaning closer one afternoon, pressing my cheek near the chill porcelain of the neighboring white tiles, and letting my gaze fill with that single black square. In those seconds, I swear I saw a flicker of something else, somewhere else. It was almost like there was a horizon in that reflective surface, a shimmering line of light bending and twisting. My breath caught in my throat, and I jerked back, stumbling against the sink. A wave of intense discomfort washed over me, sending goosebumps along my arms and making my scalp tingle. The rational part of my mind insisted it was just a trick of the eye, but no matter how hard I tried to reassure myself, I couldn't forget the unsettling sense that I had glimpsed another landscape through that tile. Over the following days, my obsession deepened. My nights became restless, filled with half-remembered dreams where I wandered across alien deserts under two suns. The sky tinged a dark, bruised purple. I found myself sweating through my sheets, my heart racing as I jolted awake, convinced that I was hearing whispers from the bathroom. The dreams were vivid, packed with unsettling geometry, sharp angles that twisted upon themselves, rock formations that breathed in unison, and swirling lights overhead that seemed to pulse in time with my own hammering pulse. When morning came, I'd drag myself into the bathroom, hands trembling, and see that black tile shining in the artificial light, as if inviting me to stare deeper. Eventually, I couldn't resist the pull. I would stand there, practically nose to the glossy surface, trying to discern shapes beyond my reflection. The more I looked, the more convinced I became that there was indeed some foreign realm hidden behind the tile's mirror-like sheen. On one particularly tense evening, I turned off the overhead light, letting only the soft glow from the hallway filter in. The black tile seemed to glow faintly from within. As my eyes adjusted, the room around me felt less familiar. The corners seemed to stretch unnaturally, and a low hum reverberated through the silence. A sudden wave of vertigo nearly knocked me off my feet. It felt as if the tile was opening, encouraging me to fall inside. In that moment, my breath was ragged. My heart thudded so violently in my chest that I could feel it in my throat, and a bead of sweat trickled down my temple. I became certain the tile was a gateway. The knowledge filled me with equal parts dread and a twisted sort of curiosity. I began to notice changes in the rest of the bathroom. The white walls weren't exactly white anymore. There was a faint grayish tint that seemed to creep across them like mold, though no actual mold was present. The corners where the tiles met lost their neat alignment. They were subtly skewed, tilting at angles that made my eyes ache when I stared too long. The single window on the bathroom wall seemed smaller, its frame slightly warped. Each time I entered, I had the feeling that the space was no longer obeying the normal laws of geometry or physics. I stopped inviting people over to my home. I found excuses to avoid letting anyone near the bathroom, afraid they might sense something or ask about the bizarre changes. My anxiety flared whenever I passed that door, an almost tangible fear that something might be waiting on the other side. And yet, I felt compelled to keep checking it. Several times I woke in the middle of the night, covered in cold sweat, convinced I'd heard a soft chanting. My mind told me I must be hallucinating from stress, but the chills rippling through my body didn't care about rational explanations. Late one night, I stood in the bathroom doorway, the hall light at my back, and observed the steady transformation. The mirror above the sink reflected an unfamiliar room. Instead of the usual neat arrangement of toothbrush and hand soap, the reflection hinted at shapes that writhed and pulsated. The air smelled of ozone and something damp, reminiscent of a cave. Even the ceiling looked slightly bowed, as though it was breathing in tandem with the walls. I felt my stomach flip, and a rising panic threatened to consume me. My skin was clammy, beads of sweat forming on my forehead. Yet I couldn't bring myself to look away. In the reflection, the black tile had doubled in size. Confusion overtook me. I was certain only one tile had been black, but within the mirror, I saw two black squares, side by side, each emanating that same unsettling shimmer. When I turned to look at the actual tiles, though, I still saw just one. Was the reflection lying, or was it showing me an inevitable future, a preview of what was creeping into our reality? The possibility that my mind was fracturing under stress haunted me. My heart hammered, and I ran a hand through my sweat-damp hair, telling myself I must be exhausted, that I needed rest. But I knew in my core that no amount of rest would dispel the creeping sense of dread. I began to hear a faint voice, or multiple voices, whenever I lingered in the bathroom. They didn't speak in a language I could decipher. The intonations rose and fell like a sinister melody, reminding me of murmured chanting heard through a thick wall. The sounds seeped into my consciousness, prodding my paranoia. My hands would shake whenever I turned the doorknob, and my legs felt like lead as I stepped over the threshold. At times, I caught myself murmuring words in an unfamiliar language under my breath, only to jolt in horror at the realization of what I was doing. It was as if the portal, or whatever it was, had started to take root in my mind. The transformation of the bathroom accelerated. Small cracks appeared in the white tiles, but instead of normal fractures, they formed swirling patterns that glowed faintly. On some days, I'd see them crawl across the surface in real time, as though living vines were under the ceramic, spreading their roots. The standard bathroom fixtures began to look warped. The sink's basin was no longer a neat oval, but an elongated shape with edges that seemed to ripple under the light. Even my reflection became alien. My eyes looked sunken, the skin around them stretched taut, and the darkness beneath them seemed to deepen daily. I was losing myself to this other dimension, slowly but surely. My nights were hellish. I often dreamed of stepping into the bathroom and finding it transformed into a vast corridor of black tiles that led onward infinitely. In these dreams, the walls pulsed like organic tissue, and overhead lights flickered in and out of existence. The floor beneath my feet felt spongy, as though I was treading on a giant creature's back. Always, the same indescribable voices echoed around me, urging me forward. There was no sense of safety, only the overwhelming certainty that something waited at the end of that corridor, something enormous and ancient that had taken notice of me. One evening, I caught sight of my own reflection in the black tile, but it wasn't exactly me. The figure's features were distorted, cheeks sunken, eyes much larger and darker than my own. Its lips moved, forming words I couldn't make out. I felt my chest tighten and a lump formed in my throat. Despite my terror, I leaned closer, ignoring the tears burning the corners of my eyes, ignoring the sweat dripping down my face. My reflection appeared to beckon me, arms outstretched, a silent invitation to come through to wherever it was. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I felt my knees threaten to buckle. At some point, my desperation drove me to attempt to rip out the tile altogether. I grabbed a hammer and chisel, marched into the bathroom, and aimed the chisel's point at that obsidian square. But as soon as I touched the chisel to the tile, I was seized by a violent wave of vertigo. The walls seemed to lurch inward, the tiles rippling like water. My vision blurred, and I heard those voices pitch into a discordant roar. The chisel fell from my trembling grip as I collapsed against the bathtub, panting and shaking. When the dizziness subsided, I found a small hairline crack where the chisel had struck, but the tile itself seemed intact. It felt almost alive, guarding itself against my intrusion. Realizing brute force was useless, I toyed with the idea of abandoning my apartment altogether. But a grim curiosity kept me tethered. Part of me needed to know what was on the other side of that tile, whether it was an actual gateway or just a manifestation of my deteriorating mind. I resolved to face it. My body trembled with fear each time I stepped inside the bathroom, yet I returned again and again, drawn like a moth to the flame. The changes continued. Corners twisted further, the tile cracks glowed brighter, and the fixture surfaces pulsed like living tissue. The chanting voices became louder, no longer muffled but echoing as though just behind a thin veil. I started to notice my own heartbeat syncing with that rhythmic chant, a throbbing tempo that resonated in my bones. On the final night of my ordeal, I found the bathroom fully transformed. The walls were a patchwork of shifting geometry, each tile appearing to breathe in slow, deliberate patterns. The air was thick and humid, carrying a strange metallic taste that made me gag. I could see faint lights flickering inside the black tile, like distant stars in a violet sky. My heart thundered in my chest and my breathing came in sharp, shallow gasps. My body tingled with an unsettling combination of fear and fascination. As I stepped forward, the tile's reflection in the mirror no longer hid the truth. There were now 3 black tiles, aligned like a doorframe. In the dim overhead light, they glistened with an otherworldly sheen. A sudden pressure wave coursed through the room, and the walls pulsed in unison as if they were exhaling. The voices swelled in volume, swirling around me from every direction. Then, almost like a gentle breeze, I felt something tug at my consciousness, a seductive call to enter. My entire body shuddered, drenched in cold sweat, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. It was then I realized that I stood on the threshold of an irrevocable decision. I could flee, never to return, or I could heed that haunting call and step through. My muscles tensed, resisting every urge to be drawn further, but part of me was desperate to look straight into that alien sky I'd glimpsed so many times in my fevered dreams. I lowered myself onto trembling knees, brought my face inches from the black tile, and whispered in a voice I barely recognized as my own. There was no direct reply, but I felt the intensifying hum behind the tile, a rising vibration that rattled my teeth. My reflection in the tile stared back, twisted by the swirling energies on the other side, beckoning me onward. Just as I thought I might give in, I remembered how it felt when I nearly destroyed the tile. The wave of vertigo, the raw panic, the sense that the portal itself was fighting back. It confirmed that whatever lay beyond wanted me, and not for any benevolent purpose. Summoning every ounce of resolve, I forced myself to stand. My knees almost gave out, but I managed to reel back, step by step, away from the tile's mesmerizing glow. I felt the air grow heavy with disappointment, as though the presence lurking just beyond the portal recognized my refusal. I staggered out of the bathroom, slammed the door, and fled my apartment that very night. I found refuge in a small motel a few miles away, heart still hammering, nerves frayed. In the silent darkness of that cramped room, every part of me quaked with lingering terror. I felt violated, as if something had wormed its way inside my mind. The hours stretched on, but I knew I couldn't return to that place if I wanted to remain sane. Yet the need for closure gnawed at me. In the morning, when the first rays of sunlight broke through the cheap blinds, I came to a bitter realization. The portal might remain, lingering in that lonely bathroom, growing stronger. Or maybe it would wait for me or another unfortunate soul to come across it. But I couldn't destroy myself trying to stop it, not when it seemed to possess its own horrifying will. I left the apartment soon after, cutting my losses. I'd like to claim I found peace, that my nightmares ended, but every time I close my eyes, I still see that stretch of alien horizon shimmering in my mind, feel that unearthly call vibrating in my bones. At times my chest tightens for no discernible reason, and I recall the suffocating atmosphere of that bathroom. My thirst for answers still nags at me, but I refuse to sacrifice the last shards of my sanity. Even now, I can't be sure if the portal truly bridged two realities, or if I stumbled across something far more insidious. Sometimes I'm convinced I only escaped physically, that part of me remains in that other dimension. The memory weighs on me like a sickness, leaving me haunted by the knowledge that no door truly stays shut once it's been opened. And I pray, in the silent spaces of my restless mind, that the nightmares remain just that, and not a prelude to something worse, lurking on the other side of the mirror, waiting to break through. Story 5. The first time I noticed the shifting shadow, I was standing by my living room window, gazing out at the neon-lit skyline of the city. A foul electric hum seemed to buzz in my ears, though I couldn't pinpoint its source. My skin crawled, as if my nerves had been charged by a sudden jolt of static. Then I saw it, lingering in the far corner of the ceiling like a smudge of soot that kept expanding, devouring the pallid light of the overhead lamp. Instantly, an uneasy knot formed in my stomach, and my lungs constricted in a shallow breath. It was as though my body sensed something dangerous long before my mind could register the threat. I tried to brush off the experience as a trick of the eyes or an unusual play of shadow. But later that night, as I was brushing my teeth, I glimpsed that same dark stain huddled behind the shower curtain. My heart pounded, loud enough to reverberate in my ears, and cold sweat trickled down my temples. I threw the shower curtain aside, convinced I would catch some intruder. Yet there was nothing, only the ordinary pastel tiles and a quietness so heavy it seemed to press down on me. My rational mind insisted it was just paranoia, but the goosebumps on my arms refused to settle. Over the following days, small details in my apartment began to unnerve me. The lights flickered randomly, even though I replaced the bulbs. The corners of my rooms felt darker and more oppressive at night, as if the shadows themselves were thickening. I heard a dull scraping sound coming from the walls, like nails dragging along concrete. On 2 separate occasions, I'd wake in the early hours of the morning with a sense that someone had been standing at the foot of my bed. Each time I bolted upright, heart thundering, only to find emptiness and the echo of my own startled breathing. A neighbor mentioned in passing that people around the building had been feeling somewhat drained lately, complaining of fatigue and weird dreams. He sounded hesitant, as if he didn't want to admit it outright, but he alluded to the notion that something might be off in our old complex. I remember noticing how his eyes appeared dull, as if the light behind them had dimmed. The next day, I ran into another resident who spoke about hearing voices in the stairwell at odd hours. Her story came to me in fragments of anxious rumor. She claimed that at night, the hallways felt narrower, and the walls seemed to vibrate with an unsettling frequency. These whispered stories amplified my own sense of foreboding. My gut churned whenever I returned home after dusk. I often found myself lingering in my car or in the lobby, forcing myself to push forward only when I had no other choice. Each time I inserted my key into the lock, I swore I felt a slight suction from the other side, like the apartment itself was inhaling. My palms would sweat, and my heart rate would spike for no apparent reason. Sometimes, in the silence of the living room, I sensed a presence behind me, an odd displacement of air, a faint whisper of movement. But whenever I turned, there was nothing but a flicker in my peripheral vision. Eventually, that murky blot in the corners began to coalesce into a vaguely humanoid shape. At first, it was just an outline that glimmered with dark tendrils, flickering in and out of sight like some half-real phantom. My breath would catch whenever I realized it was there, perched along the ceiling or crouched in a shadowy part of the room. I tried to deny its existence, telling myself it was my imagination. But the more I ignored it, the more tangible it became. Bit by bit, it grew limbs, several elongated arms and legs that appeared too long for any natural creature. The moment I recognized the formation of those limbs, my blood went ice cold, and an involuntary shudder ran through me, as if my body wanted to shut down rather than confront this impossible thing. I felt my strength waning at around the same time. Waking up in the morning became excruciatingly difficult. Each day, I dragged myself out of bed feeling as though I hadn't slept for months. My eyes stung, my limbs felt heavy, and my thoughts were sluggish. It was more than just exhaustion. There was a numbness beneath my skin. I caught myself forgetting simple things, like whether I had locked the door or taken out the trash. Sometimes I'd stand in the middle of a room with no recollection of what I had been about to do. It was as though chunks of my memory had been snatched away by an invisible hand. That's when I started suspecting that the shadow creature was feeding on me somehow, draining my energy, my memories, or perhaps my very sense of self. My reasoning sounded absurd even to me, but I couldn't ignore the pattern. Every time I sensed that black figure looming around, I'd feel an immediate wave of dizziness, followed by an almost electric weakness coursing through my body. My tongue would go dry, my muscles would tense up, and the hair on the back of my neck would stand erect, as though it were siphoning my vitality. And after each encounter, I felt a little less like myself. Desperate for answers, I began talking with other tenants more frequently. I rarely quoted their words directly, preferring the vague retellings of their experiences, partly because I didn't want to sound like I was accusing them of anything, and partly because it felt safer to keep these dark rumors indirect. Some hinted they had glimpsed a hazy silhouette crawling along their walls. Others admitted feeling as though something watched them from the ventilation system. One person described a bizarre moment when the walls in his hallway seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in subtle pulses. He confided that he'd been plagued by spells of forgetfulness too, along with bouts of inexplicable anxiety. Through these scattered confessions, I pieced together a disturbing theory. Whatever this entity was, it existed in the spaces we rarely notice. The gaps between our apartments, the neglected corners behind walls, the crawl spaces above the ceiling. It was like a parasite weaving itself throughout the building, nibbling away at each resident's energy and sense of reality. And, alarmingly, I started noticing that some neighbors no longer looked or behaved like their usual selves. They wore the same faces and had the same voices, yet there was an eerie vacancy in their expressions. Their movements were a fraction slower, almost mechanical, as if they were incomplete imitations of human beings. One evening I was returning home and passed by the man from 2 doors down. He was standing in the corridor, body stiff as a mannequin, staring at a wall. His eyes seemed lost, his mouth slightly ajar. I called his name, but he didn't even flinch. Minutes later, he turned around slowly and offered a polite greeting, though his voice was flat. My heart pounded as I recognized something fundamentally wrong in his gaze. I quickly muttered a response and hurried into my apartment, chest constricting. The whole episode left me drenched in cold sweat. That same night, the black cloud in my living room grew larger. It unfurled itself until it stood about 8 feet tall, its multiple arms angled in unnatural curves. A shapeless head, darker than a starless sky, seemed to tilt and track my every movement. My legs trembled so violently I could barely remain upright. A ringing sensation drilled into my ears and I felt short of breath, as if the air had turned poisonous. In that moment, my fear erupted into something almost violent. My fight or flight response flared, and I tensed like a cornered animal. It didn't attack me physically. Instead, it leaned toward me in a slow, fluid motion, its limbs contorting with an elegance that was both mesmerizing and horrifying. I felt an overwhelming wave of fatigue wash over my body, and my vision blurred. I struggled to remain conscious, clenching my teeth so hard my jaw ached. The next thing I remember, I was sprawled on my living room floor, gasping for air, unsure how much time had passed. My limbs tingled as though thousands of pins and needles jabbed at my flesh. The days that followed were a haze. My short-term memory was riddled with holes. I would find half-eaten meals left on the kitchen counter and discover that I had missed phone calls from coworkers without recalling hearing the phone ring. At one point, I tried recounting my experiences to a friend on the phone, but my words seemed to vanish mid-sentence. I could feel the presence of that thing looming in the periphery of my consciousness, stretching its tendrils deeper into my life. I sought refuge in the basement parking lot, hoping that being away from the apartment walls might offer me some respite. But even there, the overhead lights flickered incessantly, and I heard muffled scraping sounds echo through the cement pillars. Fear twisted my stomach, and my breathing became ragged. It felt like the entire building was steeped in this malignant force, a living organism that pulsed with hidden malevolence. I tried knocking on the door of another neighbor's apartment, intending to share my suspicions. But when he opened the door, his pupils were so dilated that his eyes looked nearly black. He asked if I was feeling well, voice disturbingly calm, and suggested that I should stay in my own unit until I felt more like myself. That was the moment I realized I might be the only one left who hadn't been fully consumed or replaced. I retreated to my apartment, slammed the door behind me, and pressed my forehead against it, heart pounding like a jackhammer in my chest. My thoughts raced, and every nerve in my body screamed for me to run, to flee the building entirely. But something told me if I left, I might never be free of it. It had my scent, my essence. It was connected to everyone here, using them as conduits to track me and feed on me no matter where I went. Night fell, and the storm outside battered my windows with relentless wind and rain. The lights in my apartment flickered until they finally died, plunging the rooms into murky darkness. The only illumination came from intermittent flashes of lightning, which revealed quick snapshots of that towering mass in the corner. Each flash etched the creature's elongated limbs and featureless head into my vision. My skin prickled with dread, and I felt a rolling wave of nausea. My breath came in short, shuddering gulps. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribcage as though it wanted to burst free. Then I heard a soft scraping on the inside of my walls. It sounded like long fingers slowly being dragged across the plaster, searching for a way in. Panic seized my body and I staggered backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. My chest felt tight, and my vision swam with dizzying spots of black. It was in that moment, crouched in the darkness, that I realized I had to confront this entity. Running was impossible. Reasoning with it was absurd. But if I stood there passively, it would complete whatever twisted transformation it had planned, robbing me of my memories and ultimately replacing me with some unfeeling copy. I pulled open the door to the hallway, certain I would find the same pitch-black gloom. But to my surprise, the corridor lights were still on, casting a sickly yellowish hue over the walls. The patterns in the carpet seemed alive, swirling with each of my steps. I heard a faint buzzing, like fluorescent bulbs on their last legs, but louder and more menacing. As I moved, my knees wobbled and my teeth chattered. The atmosphere felt thick, claustrophobic, as though the building itself were breathing down my neck. I marched toward the stairwell. Every landing and every corner felt tighter than before, the air clogged with an invisible heaviness. My own pulse roared in my ears. Eventually, I reached the top floor, a place I'd never explored. The door was ajar, and from the darkness beyond I sensed the presence of that shape, bigger now, spreading itself across the walls. I forced my trembling legs forward, ignoring the sweat that slicked my palms and dampened my shirt. A single overhead lamp blinked, revealing glimpses of black tendrils woven through the ceiling like grotesque roots. In those flickering moments, I saw them, people from the building standing motionless. They appeared half-transparent, each face frozen in a mask of numb acceptance, as if their minds had been hijacked. I recognized a few neighbors. Their bodies flickered in and out of solidity, like ghosts tethered to the entity's influence. Their eyes glowed faintly, a sign that this thing had merged with them. I felt a surging terror, my breath coming in ragged gasps that stabbed at my lungs. At the center of the room, the black cloud formed its main body. It stood tall, arms stretched wide, limbs branching out like a hideous tree. In an erratic flash of light, I saw that it was studded with faces of the tenants who had been consumed, each one an imprint smoldering in the darkness. Every face was locked in an expression of silent horror. My insides twisted in revulsion, and my vision blurred momentarily. I stood there, fists clenched at my sides, unsure if I could do anything at all. Yet I felt an urgent impulse to resist. I remembered the fragments of my memory that it had taken, the hours and days that vanished, and the sense of self it was devouring. Summoning all my will, I glared at the entity. My chest burned with fear and anger, and I could feel my own heartbeat pounding so fiercely I thought I might collapse. A sudden thunderclap resonated through the building, shaking the walls. For a second, the light surged back to full brightness. That flicker of energy seemed to startle the creature, and I saw it recoil, limbs spasming in confusion. Sensing a tiny window of opportunity, I rushed for the stairs. The entity's arms flailed, and the watchers in the corner moved in unison, their heads snapping to face me. My breathing turned frantic, each exhale searing my throat. But somehow, I tore past them, nearly stumbling over my own feet. My heart slammed into my ribcage so hard I could feel it pulsating in my neck. I fled down the stairwell, certain that darkness and those impossibly long arms were mere steps behind me. My muscles felt like they were on fire, and the building's walls seemed to ripple with each footfall. Reaching my floor, I refused to stop at my apartment. Instead, I sprinted straight to the lobby. The old security desk was abandoned, the night guard's radio left spitting static into the musty air. I forced the glass doors open and burst out into the rain-soaked street. The sudden chill of the night struck me like a slap, and my lungs greedily drank in the cold air. Despite the suffocating sense of being watched, I didn't look back until I was halfway down the block. In the faint glow of a distant street lamp, I saw the faint silhouette in one of the top-floor windows. It seemed to press against the glass, limbs contorting, as if longing to break free into the world beyond. The building itself glowed with a sickly pallor, and though I shuddered under the wet onslaught of rain, I felt a small triumph in my core. I had escaped, for now. Yet even as I backed away, I couldn't ignore the persistent tug on my consciousness. Part of me sensed that the thing would never truly release me. It had fed on my essence, stolen fragments of my memory, and bound me to its grotesque hive. My heart hammered in grim acknowledgement that no matter how far I ran, it could still reach out from that labyrinth of walls and vacant apartments. That realization lingers with me. Sometimes on dark nights, I wake to a shapeless presence in my peripheral vision. My heart stutters, and I feel a damp chill spreading over my skin. More than once I've glanced at my reflection in a mirror and seen a faint shadow flicker behind me, too quick to identify. My breath catches in my throat, and a cold sweat slicks my palms. I don't know if it's truly there or if my trauma has stained my perception. Either way, the knowledge eats away at me. It's out there, pulsing in the interstices of that building, feeding on unsuspecting tenants, replacing them with versions under its control. I remain vigilant, though I can't be entirely sure of what is real and what is a phantom conjured by fear. Every so often, I recall the sensation of those elongated limbs brushing against my mind, siphoning my vitality. I feel my pulse race, my breath growing shallow, as if a piece of me still belongs to it, trapped in that hollow space between walls. I suspect that escape is a fragile illusion. The real horror is understanding that once it touches you, it never quite lets you go. The building stands, unchanged and silent to any passerby, but inside its walls, that festering presence seethes, waiting for the next faint spark of life to claim as its own. And for those of us who have seen it, that awareness is a forever burden, an unending question of whether we're truly free or if we've already been replaced by hollow reflections of ourselves. Story 6. Darkness enveloped my office at the university the night I truly understood that silence can be a living thing. My usually placid workspace, with its rows of academic journals, dim desk lamp, and solitary window overlooking the courtyard, suddenly felt charged with static. The dust motes swirling in the faint light seemed to cling to the air, hanging ominously as though they bore witness to something unseen. I felt a hollow thump in my chest, my pulse accelerating with no rational explanation. That was the precise moment I realized my sanctuary was no longer just mine. My name is Thomas Lambert. I teach comparative literature at a small, prestigious institution known for its Gothic architecture and labyrinthine hallways. Each polished corridor has a personality. Some feel solemn, others mysteriously inviting, but my office always felt neutral, almost comforting. The stack of papers needing grading was always present, a testimony to my routine. Professors typically find peace in their clutter, an organized chaos that only we understand. Yet, 1 week ago, I began noticing a subtle shift. The energy in the room was different, as if someone had rearranged the furniture in the dark without moving a single piece. At first, I brushed off the unsettling impression. I told myself I was simply tired, that my imagination was running wild after too many consecutive late nights. But I knew deep down, something else was going on. Late one evening, I was gathering research notes on symbolic representations in ancient texts. My office door creaked with every breath of wind in the hallway. I remember feeling an unexplainable sense of being watched. My body responded before my mind could rationalize the feeling. My shoulders tensed, sweat forming along my hairline. I paused in the middle of scribbling a note, listening. The overhead fluorescent light hummed dully, flickering every now and then. Then, a sharp clatter broke the quiet. I jerked upright, heart hammering so violently it felt like it was trying to escape my ribcage. Across the room, on my old wooden bookshelf, one of my ceramic bookends was lying on the floor, spinning slowly as though it had been propelled by force. I stared at it for what felt like minutes, unable to tear my eyes away. The shelf itself looked untouched, The books were neatly in place, arranged according to my personal system. After the shock subsided enough for me to move, I lifted the ceramic piece. My fingertips trembled, and I swallowed hard in an attempt to steady my breathing. I placed it back on the shelf, convinced it had simply toppled off on its own. Yet the force with which it had fallen suggested something else entirely. It hadn't slipped. It had flown. The following night was worse. I was hunched over my desk, scanning an old manuscript, when a dull scraping noise startled me. It originated from behind me, near the row of decorative statuettes I'd collected over the years, replicas of mythological figures, each holding a distinct significance in my comparative literature classes. One by one I heard them tip over. My heart pounded with such intensity that I felt dizzy. Trying not to let panic swallow me, I turned slowly, fully expecting to see all of them on their sides. To my terror, they weren't just toppled. They were levitating, quivering in midair, as if suspended by invisible strings. For a moment, my vision blurred from the raw adrenaline surging through me. Sweat trickled down my temples, my breath ragged, my lips dry and parted in disbelief. Then, as if an unseen hand had lost interest, the statuettes plummeted onto my desk and rolled across it, eventually settling in a pattern that seemed too orderly to be random. The near silence afterward was deafening. My heart thrashed like an animal trapped in a cage, and I found myself wishing for a rational explanation. A gust of wind, a misperceived reflection, anything that would ground me in the reality I once knew. I spent the rest of that night trying to rationalize. Perhaps it was stress-induced hallucinations, I told myself. Perhaps I'd dozed off without realizing. But the sweat on my shirt, the tension in my muscles, the trembling in my hands, these were real physical symptoms. I tried to recall anything I'd consumed, any medication or unusual substance that might induce these visions. Nothing came to mind. As the late hours stretched into early morning, I found myself walking the hallways, flinching at my own distorted reflection in the tinted windows. The next day, while I was away delivering a lecture, I left my office locked. To quell my growing paranoia, I decided to mention my unsettling experiences to a colleague in a vague, roundabout way. I found him in the break room. I implied that unusual things had occurred in my office, objects moving, unnerving sounds. He suggested I might be overworked. He told me that sleep deprivation can cause vivid illusions. I nodded, opting not to reveal the more bizarre details. Even in that moment, my heart thumped uncomfortably in my chest, as though warning me not to share too much. He patted me on the shoulder and said something encouraging, but I barely registered his words. My mind was anchored to the memory of those statuettes hanging in midair. In the evening, I mustered enough courage to return. Pushing open the office door felt like stepping onto the stage of an abandoned theater. My skin prickled with unease, as though 1,000 tiny needles were pressing against me. Flicking on the light, I surveyed the room with care. The statuettes seemed to be back in their rightful places, the shelves orderly. Perhaps the day's normalcy had reset the strangeness. With shaky relief, I began my nightly routine of grading and research. But soon, the flicker in the fluorescent light caught my eye again. A ripple of tension coursed through my body. I steadied my breathing, forcing a slow inhale and exhale, determined not to let fear consume me. After a few minutes, I detected a faint rustling, like paper being shifted. I turned, heart pounding, and froze. My textbooks, stacked neatly near the door, had moved. They were lined up in a bizarre pattern, forming an arc shape that ended at my desk chair. The progression was so deliberate, I nearly lost my grip on reality right then. My pulse pounded in my ears, loud enough that it seemed to drown out the hum of the light. I bent down to examine the pattern, each step feeling like I was trespassing on sacred ground. The volumes formed a neat, letter-like shape, as though spelling something with their spines. My vision blurred with fear, my throat dry. I asked myself if an intruder could have done this, but the locked door and the office's relative security made that unlikely. Besides, the precision of the arrangement felt too purposeful. It wasn't just letters. It was an entire coded message waiting to be unraveled. Over the next few nights, I became consumed by deciphering these bizarre formations. When the statuettes or books moved, I documented every shift in position, every angle, every alignment. My senses were on constant high alert. My heart rarely returned to a normal rhythm, and my hands were perpetually clammy. The entire time, I fought a suffocating sense of being watched by the inanimate objects themselves. At certain moments, I even believed I heard them whisper, a faint clicking or droning just beyond the range of human hearing. As I continued to obsess, the manifestations escalated. I would enter my office to discover the antique lamp near the window flickering in rhythmic pulses, as though it were signaling Morse code. The newly rearranged manuscripts on my desk seemed to represent star constellations I had never seen. My knees threatened to buckle each time I recognized a coherent pattern, as if the world around me was unraveling one cryptic symbol at a time. Nausea gripped me, and goosebumps erupted along my arms. Despite my overwhelming fear, I couldn't tear myself away. Something about these patterns demanded comprehension, as if my mind was the only one that could unlock their meaning. Night after night, I pored over the arrangement of objects, transcribing each configuration into notebooks with shaking fingers. The words "invisible intention" reverberated through my head, summoning an acute paranoia. My hair stood on end whenever a shift in the air made a page flutter. I knew I was too close to something monumental, something that defied conventional logic. I also noticed a creeping dread that this thing, whatever it was, might be using me as a conduit. Every muscle in my body stayed tense for hours on end, to the point where I could hardly remember what it felt like to be calm. My teaching began to suffer. Students commented that I seemed withdrawn and distant. A staff member quietly suggested I see the campus counselor, noticing my bloodshot eyes and jittery movements. I avoided direct conversation, instead offering vague excuses about a busy schedule and important research deadlines. In truth, every part of me was focused on the messages forming in my office. I was convinced that if I ignored them, something far worse would be unleashed. Eventually, the patterns started resembling a complex system of communication. Ancient runes, bits of code, geometrical symbols. My long nights of comparative literature and linguistics gave me tools to interpret them. It became clear that something non-human, yet possessing immense intelligence, was orchestrating this. The objects, books, statuettes, lamps, chairs, seemed to have melded into a single collective entity, bending to a will that was beyond my comprehension. The realization sent waves of icy terror down my spine. I could feel my skin clammy and taut, my breath shallow with dread. It was as if the entire room was alive, a singular consciousness that demanded my understanding. One evening, after countless hours wrestling with the arrangement, I finally cracked the rudimentary outline of the message. The code referenced an imminent rupture in reality, a fracture that would begin right here, in my office. My palms turned slick with cold sweat as I grasped the implication. I read the lines over and over, each time feeling my heart thunder as though it might explode. Every inch of my body screamed to flee, to leave this place and never return. But an urgent instinct kept me anchored. This bizarre collective of objects seemed to be warning me, not threatening me. They wanted me to act, to prevent, or at least prepare for, some catastrophic event. I told no one, deciding that no colleague would believe me. Even if they did, how could I possibly convey the seriousness of a cosmic tear in the fabric of reality without sounding deranged? My nights turned into a half-sleep, plagued by nightmares of the office walls pulsating, collapsing into a void. In those dreams, I was neither fully awake nor asleep. My heartbeat was a constant, frantic tattoo. Every time I woke, I found my clothes damp with sweat, my throat painfully constricted by fear. In the midst of this mental anguish, my self-doubt ballooned. Was I actually losing my mind? Could all of this be the feverish delusion of a man under too much pressure? The more I questioned my sanity, the more real the phenomenon seemed. The textual patterns were too elaborate to be imaginary. The cyclical alignment of the manuscripts, the constant rearranging of the statuettes, the flicker code of the lamp. They had a consistency that surpassed mere hallucination. My despair was so profound that my hands would shake even when I tried to drink water, and I often felt my heartbeat reverberate through my entire body in uncontrollable waves. 2 nights ago, the activity reached a crescendo. The door slammed behind me the moment I stepped inside. All around me, objects trembled. The bookshelf rattled. The papers on my desk fluttered with a frenzied life of their own, and the lamp in the corner flickered manically. My chest grew tight, my stomach churned, and I fought the urge to vomit. Summoning every ounce of courage, I confronted the center of the room, as if facing an invisible presence. My legs quivered beneath me, my lungs fighting for air. Then, in an abrupt hush, everything stilled. I could almost feel the charge in the air recede, replaced by a suffocating heaviness. On my desk, the books formed a circle. Inside that circle, the statuettes, figures of ancient gods and creatures, were positioned in a ring, each tilted at a precise angle. It was the final piece of the puzzle. My heart thundered in my chest, my breath ragged as I knelt to examine it. The arrangement revealed a date and time. Tonight, shortly after midnight. The pattern, now fully decoded, communicated a single dire warning. The rupture would happen then, in this exact spot. I felt a surge of cold adrenaline, so potent my hands went numb. My entire body shook with the realization of what was about to unfold. I tried to steel myself, to brace for an event that defies scientific explanation. The minutes slipped away while I stood there, a trembling figure in the gloom of my own office. At midnight, the light overhead crackled and died, plunging the room into near-total darkness. My breath caught in my throat, chest tight with dread, as I groped for the small flashlight in my desk drawer. A metallic taste filled my mouth and sweat rolled down my spine. Then I saw them, the statuettes glowing with a faint, otherworldly luminescence. The edges of the circle they formed seemed to blur and shift, as if space itself was fraying at the seams. My teeth chattered from raw panic, yet I forced my gaze to remain fixed on the phenomenon. I expected some catastrophic tear in reality, an explosion of cosmic energy, or a horrifying spectacle that would annihilate me. Instead, the circle shimmered like a mirage. The walls appeared to breathe in tandem with my ragged gasps. Every object in the room seemed connected by invisible threads of thought. For a moment, I sensed an immense collective presence, a unity of consciousness that transcended physical form. My office had become an aperture, a pressure point in the fabric of existence. Just when I was certain I'd be pulled into this swirling distortion, a blinding flash erupted and then receded into darkness. My flashlight flickered back to life, revealing the office in its normal state. Books scattered on the floor, statuettes resting on the desk. The overhead light buzzed, resurrecting itself. I coughed, my lungs starved for oxygen, and pressed a trembling hand to my pounding heart. No rupture had claimed me or devoured the room. Yet the space felt irrevocably changed, like a wound had opened and then sealed itself, leaving an invisible scar behind. I sank into my chair. A rush of feverish relief mingled with lingering fear. The hush in the room was profound, more like a vacuum than mere silence. The weight in my chest remained, a testament to the fact that something extraordinary had just happened. I wasn't sure if the rupture had been prevented or merely postponed. The objects no longer moved, as though they had poured every last bit of their energy into that singular moment. Their message had been delivered. In the days since, I've returned to my office with caution. The air still feels charged, but quieter, as if the presence that once animated these objects has receded into dormancy. I've deciphered no new patterns, nor have I witnessed any more levitations. Yet I can't shake the sense that this place is sitting on the edge of an unseen precipice. My nights remain sleepless, my heart rate never truly calm, my imagination haunted by the possibility that the warning might resurface in some other form. Even now, as I write these words, I feel a prickling at the nape of my neck, a subtle reminder that reality is not as solid as we like to believe. My reflection in the office window stares back at me with hollow eyes. I wonder if I have merely delayed the inevitable, or if the collective consciousness of these objects has sealed a fissure in time and space. Sometimes I catch myself listening for the faint hum of movement behind me, adrenaline surging at every unfamiliar sound. I'm left with this final realization. Once you have witnessed the boundaries of reality begin to blur, you can never return to the blissful ignorance of ordinary life. Every room holds secrets, every silence conceals a voice, and every inanimate thing may harbor a watchful awareness. Though I emerged physically intact, the unease gnaws at me constantly. If reality threatened to fracture once, there's no reason it won't happen again. The objects may lie dormant, but I am forever marked by the knowledge of what they can do and what they can warn us about. And that knowledge, more than anything, is what keeps my heart thudding relentlessly in my chest, night after sleepless night. Story 7. The moment my eyes snapped open, I sensed that something was profoundly wrong. A crushing stillness blanketed the air, so thick it felt like I might choke on it. My bedroom, illuminated only by the ghostly glow of the nightlight I always kept on, appeared strangely elongated, as though the corners were gradually creeping farther away. My heart thudded against my ribs in an irregular beat, and my throat felt parched. Something about the silence set every nerve on edge. It was the kind of quiet that made one think the entire world had paused, or worse, that it was waiting. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, half expecting the floor to tilt or give way under my feet. My body trembled with an unexplainable anticipation. As I stood, the hairs on my arms and neck stood erect, as if caught in a static storm. I listened carefully for familiar sounds: a distant heater rumble, a faint drip from the bathroom faucet, perhaps even the gentle hum of the refrigerator. Nothing. The entire house seemed to be holding its breath. When I reached for my bedroom door, I discovered it was locked from the inside. That alone made no sense. I lived alone, and I'd never installed any special mechanism on my bedroom door. It was just a simple wooden door with a standard handle that didn't even have a lock. My first instinct was to laugh at the absurdity, but the laughter died in my throat. This wasn't just a stuck door. The handle refused to turn at all, as though fused in place. My palms grew clammy, and my heartbeat thumped louder, echoing in my ears. I began to yank and twist the knob, ignoring the sting in my wrist. The door rattled but wouldn't budge. Panic gnawed at my gut, and a faint sense of claustrophobia started to tighten my chest. I tried not to succumb to it, but the sweat gathering at my temples betrayed my growing fear. Eventually, with one heavy shove of my shoulder, the door swung open as if it had suddenly decided to grant me passage. The force threw me forward into the hallway, and I caught myself against the opposite wall. My relief was short-lived. The corridor before me looked altered. What had once been a short hall, leading to the bathroom and living room, seemed to stretch on and on. The overhead light flickered, casting frantic shadows that made the walls appear to pulse. As I tried to steady my breathing, I noticed something else unnerving. Every other door in the hallway was closed. Worse, I could see that each had a new, heavy lock built into it, none of which had ever been there before. The sight of so many barricaded doors made my stomach knot. A sour taste rose in my throat. I touched the lock on the bathroom door, cold metal, seamlessly integrated into the wood, as though it had been installed ages ago. My heart hammered at the realization that I was trapped in my own home by something impossible. My fingers felt shaky against the doorknob. I tested it. Locked. I tried a second door. Locked again. That's when I first heard the faint scraping sound, like nails along wood. It came from behind me, from the direction of my bedroom. My pulse lurched, and I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance. The door I'd just come through was shut once more, the knob twisting of its own accord, and a low, rhythmic scratching reverberated through the wood. Fear surged in my veins, and I pressed my body against the wall, as if making myself smaller would help. The scraping eventually faded, leaving me with only the pounding of my pulse in my ears. Fighting to steady my breath, I pressed forward, step by step, down the elongated corridor. Every footstep echoed, though the hallway had always been carpeted. I tried flipping the light switch on the wall, hoping to restore normalcy, but the bulb flickered with a sickly glow before plunging me into semi-darkness. The corridor remained dimly lit by what looked like an impossible moonlight filtering through the closed blinds of a nearby window. My mind scrambled to make sense of it. Moonlight shouldn't have been that bright, or that color. It was tinted a nauseating greenish hue. I approached the door at the very end of the corridor, one that, in my memory, led to a small storage closet. My mind conjured the image of boxes stacked in disarray, old coats and dusty tools. But I could sense it would be different now. Heart thudding, I slowly turned the lock. A harsh click announced the moment I got it open, as though something on the other side had unlocked it for me. When I stepped through, I found myself not in a closet at all, but in a familiar living space. Familiar, yet profoundly wrong. The area resembled my old apartment from years back, complete with the lumpy armchair I once owned, and the cheap coffee table where I had spilled drinks countless times. The air smelled stale, tinged with the faint stench of mildew and something metallic. The layout was eerily accurate. My breath caught in my throat. This was the apartment I'd lived in during a particularly rough period in my life. I recognized the stains on the worn-out carpet, the chipped paint on the walls. The memory of that time clawed at me. Isolation, deep loneliness, and nights spent pacing in silent dread. It felt as though the walls were watching me, or rather, that the room itself was an extension of my mind, confronting me with a piece of my past I'd tried to bury. My heart pounded faster. I could almost hear my own anxious whispers from years ago, the ones I used to mumble whenever the weight of hopelessness pressed down on me. A sensation of being observed prickled across my back. Although I saw no one, the certainty that something was there sent icy tremors through my limbs. A single door stood on the far side, so I headed toward it, ignoring the growing sense that the floor might buckle. Each step was an ordeal. I felt lightheaded, my vision narrowing at the edges. Even my breathing went ragged. The doorknob was cold against my palm, just like the rest, and initially refused to budge. A low, grinding sound emanated from inside the walls, as though metal gears were shifting behind the plaster, deciding whether to let me pass. Then, abruptly, the door popped open. Beyond it lay a corridor again, yet this one was unrecognizable. I stepped onto tiles that reflected my distorted reflection, the lines of my face twisting in the gleam. My reflection's eyes looked unnaturally wide, sunken, and full of desperation. I pushed that image away from my mind and pressed onward. The corridor's ceiling arched overhead with stained glass panels. Murky shapes moved behind them, shapeless shadows that glided in silence. My heart rate quickened, and I could practically feel my blood pulsing in my temples. The sense that I was being watched only heightened. I stopped when I came to another locked door. An eerie hush filled the corridor, broken only by the sound of my unsteady breathing. The metal lock clicked under my fingers, and I felt a wave of dread surge through me as I pushed the door open. Inside was a room I immediately recognized but had never wanted to see again. It was the conference room from my old job, one where I'd once experienced a humiliating series of confrontations with colleagues. The overhead lights flickered, casting everything in a sickly fluorescent glare. The table was ringed with empty chairs, my throat constricted with the memory of sitting there, feeling cornered, anxious sweat rolling down my back as I had been peppered with accusations about missed deadlines and lack of focus. Stepping into that space, I felt my pulse pounding against the inside of my skull. My breathing quickened, the dryness in my mouth intensifying until I feared I might gag. The walls stretched wide, far wider than that conference room had ever been in reality, and a constant droning hum emanated from the fluorescent tubes overhead. I heard what sounded like whispered accusations threading through the hum. My name, criticisms, half-syllables that barely rose above the static. I couldn't discern the exact words, but I felt their venom deep in my bones. My palms were slick with sweat, and a chill slid along my spine. There was no one in the chairs, yet I could almost sense them filled with silhouettes from my past, all leaning forward in silent disapproval. I fumbled my way to another door, this time a heavy, black steel one at the back. As soon as I gripped its handle, a jolt ran up my arm, as if the metal were charged. My vision blurred momentarily and I swayed on my feet, my heart hammering. Then the door swung open, leading me into a shadowy corridor that smelled damp, like earth and rusted pipes. My breath shuddered with each inhale. The walls were lined with flickering lights that gave off a faint buzzing sound. I forced myself to keep moving, wiping sweat from my brow with the back of my hand. My shirt clung to my skin, every inch of me soaked in cold perspiration. The hall turned left, then twisted right, then sloped downward in a serpentine path that made no architectural sense for my home. By then, I understood the truth. My house had become a maze of my own darkest memories, guided by some malevolent force. With each door I opened, I was traveling deeper into my own psyche, each room a stage for my regrets and anxieties. The next door, a stark white panel, revealed a cluttered space reminiscent of an old storage unit I'd once rented. Boxes towered precariously, marked with big black letters. My chest tightened at the thought of rummaging through them, certain they would reveal the remnants of a past relationship I'd locked away in cardboard and tried to forget. I inched forward, feeling as though I was trespassing in a museum of my own failures. My breath caught when I noticed the largest box in the corner with my name scrawled on it. It felt as if the walls were closing in, suffocating me with memory and guilt. I managed to pry the box open just enough to see personal items I had assumed were lost or thrown out. Battered notebooks filled with my old scribbles, a few photos, a broken necklace. I felt a flash of anger and embarrassment. My body trembled, and I could hear my pulse loud in my ears. The sense of being watched grew stronger, as though the shadows in the corners held living, hungry forms. I slammed the box shut and stumbled back, swallowing the urge to call out for help. There was no one to hear me anyway. As I turned to escape that room, I noticed another corridor had appeared on the opposite side, one that shouldn't have existed at all. Its floor was covered in what felt like thin, wet carpeting that squished under my shoes. The air was damp and heavy, making each breath more difficult. At times, the walls seemed to ripple like the surface of a pond, reflecting an image of my anxious face that distorted with every step. A sense of dread so powerful it practically roared flooded my senses, and my heart pounded at a pace I feared was unsustainable. Finally, I arrived at a single imposing door, marked by intricate, spiraling carvings. Each swirl seemed to shift under my gaze, forming patterns that teased the edges of my vision. My palms were sweaty, heart thrashing in my chest. I felt compelled to open it, though every cell in my body screamed to flee. With trembling fingers, I pressed the handle. To my surprise, it turned smoothly, and the door swung open without resistance. Inside was a version of my living room, except the furniture was arranged in a warped fashion. The walls angled impossibly, corners twisting into elongated points. The windows were covered by thick black drapes that seemed to breathe in and out with a silent rhythm. My living room table was in the center, and on it sat a single object, an old mirror I faintly recalled from some distant place in my life. Its tarnished frame looked corroded, as if eaten away by time and regret. My reflection was dim, as though I were looking at a version of myself from underwater. I saw not just my face, but flickering shapes behind me, shadows that stood upright, looming in silent condemnation. My chest tightened, and I felt my breath falter, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. This was no ordinary reflection. I sensed an intelligence behind the glass, something that gazed back at me with ancient, callous eyes. For a terrifying moment, it felt as though the glass might fracture, unleashing whatever was behind it. I pressed my lips together to keep from crying out. The presence in the mirror felt intimately tied to my most buried fears, the pieces of my mind I'd tried hardest to repress. Each labored inhale seemed to pull that presence closer. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the reflection, sweat trickling down my temples, hands shaking. My body trembled under a crushing weight, a near certainty that this presence wanted something from me. Or perhaps it was feeding on my anxiety, my guilt. When I finally found the strength to back away, the reflection in the mirror lingered a fraction of a second longer than I did, lips parted as if in a silent sneer. My heart raced in terror at the realization that my reflection wasn't perfectly mirroring me. I stumbled toward another door, the door I recognized as the original front door of my house. I couldn't fathom how it was now inside the living room, but sense had abandoned me long ago. My head pounded. My breath came in ragged gasps. Every muscle in my body quivered, strung taut by fear. Summoning every ounce of will, I reached out for the doorknob, hardly daring to hope it would open. Behind me, I heard a faint hiss, something scraping along the floor as if to drag me back. The doorknob twisted under my hand, and with a final burst of desperate energy, I pulled the door open. A rush of cool air struck me like a jolt of electricity. Bright light flooded in, blinding me momentarily. My heart thundered in my ears. I half expected the door to slam shut again, or the corridor to twist away, but it didn't. I stumbled outside, heart nearly exploding with relief and confusion. The oppressive silence was replaced by distant city sounds, cars, a faint hum of life. My legs shook so badly that I sank to my knees on the porch. My home, viewed from the outside, looked entirely normal. Familiar siding, windows, and roof. But I could still feel it behind those walls, the shifting hallways and twisted rooms. A labyrinth of my nightmares manifested in real space. A breeze swept across my sweat-drenched shirt, causing me to shiver. My head spun, trying to process the impossible. I stood, unsteady, leaning against the porch railing as I stared at the front door. In my mind's eye, I saw all the memories I had just confronted. The house still held them, rearranging itself to reflect each regret, every misstep. And I felt, with a raw certainty, that something inside there was alive, ancient, malevolent, feeding off my hidden shame. I don't know how long I stayed on the porch, just breathing, letting the cool air ground me. My heartbeat gradually slowed from a frantic hammering to something almost normal. I could feel my sanity slipping, or at least altering, as though I had glimpsed a hidden truth about the link between my psyche and the walls that should have been my refuge. Even though I was no longer inside, I felt the house's presence in every cell of my body, as if a piece of it had latched onto me. Finally, I forced myself to stand upright and face the door one last time. A nauseating wave of dizziness told me that the barrier between my mind and that grotesque interior might never fully heal. I sensed that if I opened the door again, the horrors would return, more twisted than before. Yet part of me felt an unsettling pull toward it, as if unraveling its mystery had become my purpose. My muscles trembled with indecision. My mouth was dry as dust, and my lungs still struggled to regulate my breathing. In the end, I stepped back. I couldn't bring myself to cross that threshold again. The weight of the malevolent force inside pressed against my back as I turned away. My only consolation was the realization that whatever that presence was, it didn't fully own me. I had walked out, though my memories and regrets still felt painfully real. As I reached the sidewalk, it was as if the oppressive atmosphere dissipated slightly. Yet a lingering dread haunted me. I knew the house was there, twisting its corridors, reshaping my past, waiting for the next moment I might dare to enter. The certainty that it wouldn't stay quiet for long gnawed at me. Even from the sidewalk, I felt a faint, rhythmic thrum in the ground, like a slow, measured heartbeat. It pulsed against the soles of my shoes, an unspoken promise that the entity inside would continue to manipulate my memories and my reality, if given the chance. My breath hitched, but I forced myself to continue walking, feeling both relieved and unhinged. Though my body had escaped, I couldn't escape the knowledge that some part of me was still entwined with that place. Whenever I shut my eyes, I felt the locked doors pressing in on my consciousness, reminding me that I was only ever a few steps away from confronting them again. A chilling thought took root, sending cold sweat rolling down my spine. Perhaps this wasn't over. Perhaps it never would be. Even now, I struggle to regain my composure, to recall how everyday life used to feel. My heart is unsteady, my throat still feels like sandpaper, and my hands haven't stopped trembling. The house behind me stands silent and unassuming, but in my mind, it remains an endless maze of haunted corridors, filled with the echoes of my own pain, manipulated by something I can't fully comprehend. I have no idea what would happen if I tried to sell this place, or even burn it down. Maybe it doesn't matter. The house is in me now, a living testament to all the horrors I refused to face, until it twisted them into living nightmares. I breathe in, tasting the faint tang of metal in the air. The sun creeps over the horizon, painting the sky with pale oranges and pinks, a stark contrast to the dark labyrinth lurking within those walls. My gaze flickers toward the front door again. Despite the light, the building's silhouette seems to loom, thick with shadows, as though waiting for my return. And that knowledge, that it waits with infinite patience, is perhaps the greatest horror of all. Story 8. The rain hammered against the warped window panes from the moment I arrived, like frantic fingertips begging for entry. Before I had the chance to properly cross the threshold, I felt my heart thudding in my chest, an inexplicable weight pressing against my ribs. The house, my uncle's century-old property, loomed before me with an air of silent menace, its pitched roof and stained glass panels whispering warnings I couldn't quite decipher. Even the wind seemed to carry a low, mournful sound as it curled around the gables, echoing in the eaves. I remember stepping inside and immediately sensing that the house had been waiting, watching, and anticipating my arrival. My throat was uncomfortably dry, and I licked my lips in an attempt to muster some moisture. The old floorboards groaned beneath my feet, resonating with my mounting unease. I had come into possession of this house under circumstances I still find bewildering. My uncle had, in his own cryptic way, transferred ownership to me before moving on to some distant place. He kept sending me letters about the importance of safeguarding the legacy, but he never provided details on what exactly needed safeguarding. He simply vanished from my life, leaving me a thick ring of keys and a brief note that said I should explore every inch of the house before making any decisions about it. At the time, I assumed he just wanted me to continue the family's tradition of meticulously preserving antiques. I quickly realized, however, that he had left me something far more unsettling than a mere museum of old curiosities. From the first night, the house's atmosphere embraced me like a set of cold, clammy hands. My breathing came in quick, stunted gasps, while I fumbled around in half-darkness to locate light switches. When I finally found one, a single weak bulb illuminated the foyer. Shadows stretched across the walls in twisted shapes that seemed to retreat the moment my gaze fell upon them. I couldn't tell if the shapes were illusions triggered by my tired mind, or if the house was genuinely pulsing with some hidden life of its own. In the early days, the disturbances were subtle. I would catch a glimpse of a fleeting movement in the corners of mirrors I didn't remember hanging on the walls. Sometimes, as I strolled down a corridor, I felt a gentle push against my back, as though someone had brushed past me in a hurry. More than once, I would wake to the faint echo of footsteps in the hallway, or the muted scrape of what sounded like furniture being dragged across another room. My heart would pound so fiercely that I feared it might give out. I found it impossible to return to sleep after these episodes, my thoughts racing, my mouth so dry that every breath seemed to burn my throat. Morning brought little relief, for the daylight only served to highlight strange details, odd markings etched into the wallpaper, or old photos of relatives whose faces seemed to have changed overnight. Sometimes I noticed new objects on the shelves, silver candlesticks, dusty figurines, that I had no memory of unpacking. Determined to figure out what was happening, I started an exhaustive exploration of the house. The building had clearly undergone several expansions and renovations over the decades, and the architecture seemed deliberately labyrinthine. Some hallways led me in circles, and certain doors opened onto dead-end passages. Along the ground floor, I discovered a narrow stairwell hidden behind a false wall in the pantry. The steps were so uneven that I had to grip a rickety railing with both hands, my palms slick with cold sweat. Every step produced a long, groaning squeak that reverberated through the darkness. An intense odor of stagnant air hung around me, thick enough to taste on my tongue. It was musty, laced with something like old incense that had gone sour. The stairwell led to a dusty chamber that housed a row of tall, ornate mirrors, each leaning against the wall at a slight angle. Their frames were carved with twisting patterns, reminiscent of vines merging into animal shapes. Seeing my reflection in that dim, flickering glow, the only illumination came from a small, barred window. I noticed something that made me freeze. In each mirror, my reflection looked subtly different. In one, my posture was slightly skewed, my head tilted as though sizing me up. In another, the expression on my face bordered on a sneer, faint but unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a rush of goosebumps crawl over my entire body. I stepped closer, trying to rationalize the strange phenomenon. Maybe it was an illusion caused by the angle of the mirrors or the diffused light. But when I reached out to touch the surface, my reflection delayed its movement for just the tiniest fraction of a second. That discrepancy, that impossibility, sent a jolt of panic through my entire nervous system. I spun around, fleeing the chamber with my heart thudding. Back upstairs, I locked the pantry door behind me, hoping that would keep whatever I had seen contained. But the sense of being watched refused to leave. It felt as though every angle of the house was equipped with those elaborate mirrors, concealed behind walls or hidden in corners, capturing glimpses of me whether I liked it or not. Later, while scouring the attic for anything that might clarify these eerie findings, I stumbled upon old journals and letters. They appeared to be in my uncle's handwriting, though some passages were penned by others from decades past. The more I read, the more I understood. The house was built on a foundation of secrets. Previous occupants had conducted elaborate rituals involving mirrors, capturing and preserving reflections to gain insight into events that had transpired there. These illusions were said to act as a record, a living history of the house. The letters hinted that once a reflection was captured, it could exist beyond the confines of the moment in which it was formed, lingering in mirrors as a fragment of the past. My uncle's notes suggested that he had taken this practice even further, attempting to harness these reflections as portals, bridging the gap between what is and what was. The day I discovered the first hidden corridor running parallel to the main hallway was the day my perception began to crack. Walking through that corridor, I recognized small rectangular apertures set into the walls, vantage points through which one could peer into each room via the backside of a mirror. With the house's entire interior lined with these mirrors, it was as though the place itself was an observer, an all-seeing presence that watched inhabitants from every possible angle. The atmosphere in that narrow passage was suffocating. I heard the faint drip of condensation, the only sound to break the pulsing silence. The air was thick with the smell of damp plaster and old wood. The meager, flickering light from my flashlight danced across the cramped space, projecting my shadow onto the walls in elongated shapes that seemed to move independently of me. My heart pounded so loudly that it seemed to resonate off the walls, and my breathing turned rapid and harsh. As I looked through one of the apertures, I saw the living room from behind its mirror. At first, it was just the furniture in the same disheveled state I'd left it. Then, in the reflection, a figure emerged. It was me, or rather, a version of me, walking into the room. But it couldn't be happening in real time because I was crouched in that corridor watching. The reflection of me looked older, or maybe just more haunted. The posture was unnatural, rigid shoulders, arms held stiffly at the sides. My jaw clenched tight, my lips curled downward in a scowl I'd never seen on my own face. When the reflection turned, I saw its eyes fixed right on the mirror, right on the vantage point where I was spying. My pulse hammered, and for a moment, I thought I was going to be sick. I yanked myself away from the opening and leaned against the clammy wall, feeling beads of cold sweat sliding down my temples. In one of the attic journals, I had read a cryptic passage. The reflection unbound may claim the one who cast it. The words played in my mind, refusing to be dismissed as mere superstition. The house, with its labyrinth of mirrors, seemed to be performing a slow, calculated exchange. My reality for another, my identity for some alternate version. Each time I caught my reflection in a room, I noticed small changes in my own appearance afterward. Sometimes my hands would tremble uncontrollably, or my face would appear drawn and unfamiliar in the bathroom mirror. My heartbeat was a constant drum of anxiety, hammering every time I turned a corner or opened a door. Night became torturous, filled with the sensation of an unseen presence looming over my bed, pressing down on my chest until I jolted awake, gasping. When I tried to explain some of my experiences to a family acquaintance over a brief phone call, I used vague language, carefully avoiding direct mention of mirrors and reflections. They expressed alarm, suggesting that I should maybe step away from the house, but I just nodded in silence. Stepping away felt like surrendering the final shred of myself that still belonged to this world. I was possessed by a need to understand, and if possible, undo whatever was happening. During another conversation, relayed mostly in hushed, stammered phrases on my end, they hinted that my uncle had been researching the intersection of time and reflection. That cryptic statement reinforced my suspicions. He had been attempting something too large and dangerous, unleashing these alternate reflections into the house. One evening, my sense of creeping dread escalated to outright terror. I was about to retire for the night when I heard a muffled scraping sound from somewhere behind the walls. It was a slow, deliberate noise, punctuated by quiet intervals that only amplified my pounding heart. I followed the sound to the second-floor hallway. There, I discovered an entrance I had overlooked before, another hidden doorway. It led me into a cramped space behind the bathroom mirror. In the darkness, I could see vague movement. My hands shook uncontrollably as I fiddled with my flashlight. The narrow beam sliced through the blackness, illuminating the reflection of a figure crouched on the other side of the mirror. It was a reflection of me, but more disheveled, my eyes ringed with deep shadows. A primal fear clawed at the back of my throat as I realized that this other me was reaching out, pressing a hand against the glass from the inside. Without warning, the mirror rattled, and I heard a low, growling hiss, not quite human in origin. My heart slammed so hard that spots appeared in my vision, and I staggered back. I locked myself in my bedroom, chest heaving, and tried to calm my mind. Each breath felt like shards of ice slicing through my lungs. The door behind me rattled occasionally, as though a gentle pressure was testing its strength. I pressed my ear against the wood, hearing a soft whisper, or maybe just the house settling. My thoughts spun out of control. Was I hallucinating all of this? Was this some inherited madness? Or was the house orchestrating these horrors to break my resolve, to weaken my sense of self until I was ripe for replacement? As the days stretched on, I noticed the reflection in the bathroom mirror lingering even after I moved away. In other rooms, sometimes I'd walk past a reflective surface and my image wouldn't register until a second later, as though it had to catch up to my movements. I began to feel physically ill, lightheaded, nauseated, my skin clammy to the touch. My anxiety level soared. I couldn't eat. I constantly felt like I was being observed from every angle, and my heart seemed perpetually on the brink of bursting. At times, my own footsteps didn't feel like they belonged to me, as if something else was controlling my limbs. Yet I was determined to reclaim my life from the house's clutches. I decided that the only chance of resolving this was to confront the central location of these mirror anomalies. I returned to the chamber in the basement, the one with the ornate mirrors lined in a row, each harboring a reflection just different enough to make my stomach flip. The air was stifling, and I was sweating so profusely that droplets formed on my forehead and trickled down my back. My hands trembled around the flashlight, and my throat was so parched I could barely swallow. As I approached the largest mirror, I saw something move behind my reflection, a swirl of darkness, or maybe a figure passing by. My reflection's eyes seemed to darken, and its lips twitched into a mocking grin. A wave of dizziness struck me. My muscles tensed, and I felt an almost magnetic pull drawing me closer to the glass. I pressed my palm against the mirror's surface, feeling a sharp chill that spread through my hand and into my arm. Panic flared in my mind, but I forced myself to hold steady. My reflection began to shift, its features contorting into a more angular, sinister shape. It was as though it were no longer a perfect replica of me, but a version twisted by the weight of the house's hidden histories. My breath caught in my throat, and I let out a strangled gasp, my heart hammering in my chest. I closed my eyes and concentrated on the singular thought that I was me. I was the original occupant of this body, this life, this timeline. I mentally repeated my own name, my birth date, fragments of my personal history, anything to ground me in my identity. For a moment, the mirror's pull intensified, and the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. I gritted my teeth, locked my trembling knees, and forced myself to stay. Slowly, the reflection's grin faded, and the tension pulling me toward the mirror began to ease. It was as if I was wrestling with an invisible force that resided behind the glass. After what felt like an eternity of suffocating silence, the hold loosened entirely, and I staggered back, nearly collapsing onto the cold, damp floor. My heart pounded so violently that I could feel it in my throat. My breathing was labored, and my clothes were soaked in sweat. Yet something about my reflection now looked subdued, as though it had lost a portion of whatever malevolent energy it once possessed. In that moment, I understood that I wasn't free, but I had taken a crucial step. Perhaps I had shown the house, shown those reflections, that I refused to relinquish my place in the present. The system of mirrors throughout the walls still remained, each one a potential gateway or prison for the alternate reflections. The corridors were still there, waiting in the gloom, the vantage point still allowing glimpses of disturbing scenes from times long gone. But I sensed that I had disrupted some cycle. I no longer felt quite as defenseless. I left the house not long after, locking every secret door I could find, covering the mirrors with blankets, turning off the lights. My hands trembled the entire time, and my vision swam with anxiety, but I managed to seal away the hidden corridors to the best of my ability. The sound of the front door shutting behind me was a dull thud that reverberated through my chest, and for a moment, I thought I heard a distant sigh echo from the far reaches of the house. My relief was immediate, though tempered by the realization that the house still contained those reflections, still crouched within the labyrinth of glass and time. Even as I drove away, my heart thumping erratically, I felt eyes on me. My own eyes, or at least the eyes of another me, waiting in the mirrors. For the rest of my life, I suspect I'll carry that sensation like a persistent phantom pain, always glancing over my shoulder to make sure it's really my shadow following me. At night, when I see my silhouette cast against a wall, I sometimes think it twitches an instant too late. And in the corner of my vision, I catch faint movements in reflective surfaces. Nothing as overt as a sneer or a beckoning hand, but enough to send a spike of dread through my veins. I am certain the house remains silent and watchful, a hidden network of glass corridors preserving 1,000 moments, 1,000 fractured versions of reality. And though I have escaped its walls, I know the reflection I left behind is still there, waiting for an opportunity to cross that threshold once more. It's an unsettling truth that refuses to let me rest, a lingering anxiety that seeps into the corners of my mind whenever I catch a glimpse of my face in a mirror. Something else shares my features in that old house, anchored by centuries of dark curiosity, and I can't be entirely sure if I brought all of myself away when I left. Story 9. I still remember the first time I felt that acute pressure in my chest, the creeping certainty that something was seriously wrong with this place. The cabin sat on the edge of a large, dark lake, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to whisper at night. The air felt dense with unspoken secrets, and I couldn't shake the sensation that my every footstep disturbed more than just the dust on the floor. I'd come here for a break, a chance to distance myself from the noise of civilization, yet the silence here was different, alive in some twisted way. It crawled under my skin, set my nerves on edge, and made my heart pound so violently I could feel it echoing in my ears. My first few hours were almost tranquil. The cabin itself was modest, a single floor with creaking wooden planks, a small porch overlooking the water, and a cozy fireplace that looked like it had seen decades of usage. I took in the stale smell of old wood, the slight dampness in the air, the faint, lingering fragrance of something like burnt pine. Initially, I felt a sense of peace. My plan was to rest, maybe do some fishing and read a couple of books, enjoying the solitude I rarely found back home. But that night, things started to feel off. I heard scratching noises on the walls, like branches scraping against the wood, but there were no trees close enough on that side of the cabin. Occasionally, I thought I caught a shape in my peripheral vision, something darker than the shadows cast by the dim yellow lamps. My hands trembled when I reached for my flashlight, and I could feel cold beads of sweat forming on my forehead. Each breath grew shallow, as though the air was too thick to inhale properly. Even though I tried to reason it away, maybe the wind had picked up, maybe my tired eyes were playing tricks, I knew deep down that these were not normal nighttime disturbances. The second morning, I woke up shuddering from a dream that vanished the moment my eyes opened, leaving behind only the echo of intense dread. A peculiar stillness blanketed everything. The lake's surface was mirror smooth, not a single ripple or sign of life. My mouth felt parched, my throat scratchy, and even after drinking a full glass of water, I couldn't shake the dryness in my mouth. I walked around the cabin's perimeter, looking for any signs of an animal that might have caused the strange noises, but I found nothing. No footprints in the soil, no broken branches, not even a trace of wildlife. The forest itself felt unnaturally quiet, as if the birds and insects had all gone silent in fear. By late afternoon, I noticed the first real indication that this place was behaving in ways I couldn't rationalize. The wind began to swirl around the cabin, rustling the pine needles in a circular motion, almost rhythmic. It reminded me of a slow, steady heartbeat. My own heartbeat pounded wildly, racing in synchronization with that sound. I stood on the porch, leaning against the railing, trying to take deep, calming breaths. But the persistent gusts only grew stronger. I caught a glimpse of movement in the woods, a vague humanoid outline that flickered like a broken image on a failing TV screen. My heart leapt into my throat. When I pointed my flashlight toward it, the shape disappeared, replaced by the ordinary static of the forest. Yet the moment I turned away, I felt certain it was still there, watching. That night the scratching returned, but it moved along the walls more insistently, as if encircling me. Every rasping sound made my skin prickle with an icy sensation, and I had to force myself to swallow, to remind myself to breathe. I tried to distract myself, flipping through an old magazine I found in the cabin, but the words seemed wrong. They were out of order, sometimes repeated in loops, and I found lines of text bleeding from one page to the next, as though the boundaries of the pages were no longer fixed. My head began to ache. The ceiling beams groaned, the windows rattled in their frames, and I became certain that something wanted to get inside. I managed to drift off to an uneasy sleep near dawn, only to wake later to find the day almost gone. The clock on the wall read 9 a.m., yet the sky was already tinted orange with the approach of evening. My phone had lost its signal entirely. I rubbed my eyes, trying to piece together how so many hours had slipped away. My body felt weak, my muscles stiff as though I'd run a marathon in my sleep. I forced myself up, ignoring the trembling in my legs, and decided to check the surroundings again. That's when I discovered the same footprints I'd made the day before, still fresh in the dirt, as if I had never disturbed them. Time had locked into some twisted repetition, preserving details that should have changed. Each time I dozed off, I awoke disoriented, with the sense that entire weeks might have passed, or only minutes. The cabin itself seemed to be caught in a loop. The wind chimes on the porch, which initially moved in random patterns, now chimed in short, repeating sequences. The floorboards squeaked in exactly the same rhythm every time I crossed them, even though I was stepping in different spots. My reflection in the window occasionally lagged behind my actual movements, as if I was being observed by a second me, locked in a fraction of a second delay. My stomach churned with a deepening dread, and my heart would race until I tasted copper in my mouth from clenching my teeth so hard. I began to suspect that this place existed outside normal chronology. It was an island in time, repeating the final days before some catastrophic event. But the more I stayed, the more the cycle shortened. Each loop felt compressed, events overlapping in disorienting ways. I found myself caught in the same patterns, rising, pacing the porch, hearing the same creaks in the same order. But each time the atmosphere grew heavier, the shadows more distorted. My chest would tighten as I heard that same scratching on the walls, intensifying each time it recurred. Sometimes it sounded like claws, sometimes like desperate fingers trying to tear through the wood. Then the entities began to show themselves. At first I caught them in reflections, just flickers of elongated limbs behind me when I stood by the bathroom mirror. My peripheral vision would pick up angles that didn't make sense, as if something was bending light in ways not meant for our dimension. Once, while looking out at the lake, I saw the surface twist, forming shapes that rose above the water for the briefest second, then dissolved. It felt like these things were testing the boundaries, waiting for the right moment to emerge. My palms would clam up, a cold sweat trickling down my spine. My breath came in ragged gasps as I clutched the windowsill, forcing my gaze to stay on the water, even though every instinct screamed at me to run. Eventually, I found a journal hidden under the cabin's single bed. Its pages were yellowed, the writing faint, but I could make out references to the temporal fold, cycles accelerating, and an anchor. It talked about a recurring loop in which whoever set foot in the cabin would become a magnet for something beyond reason. The journal's final entries described reality thinning out, with timescapes overlapping and unstoppable forces crossing the threshold. The writer mentioned that only through direct confrontation could one break the cycle, but it never explained what form that confrontation should take. With every passing hour, the environment deteriorated. The walls felt like they were pulsing with unseen veins. The floors vibrated under my feet, as though an earthquake were contained just beneath the foundation. Outside, the wind no longer followed a natural rhythm. It had become a chaotic roar, and the pines swayed violently in a bizarre, synchronized motion. My anxiety reached a fever pitch. My heart hammered so relentlessly in my chest that my entire ribcage felt bruised. When I tried to steady my breathing, I was met with nothing but frantic gulps of air that did nothing to ease the tightness in my lungs. I decided to confront whatever was happening. Perhaps it was desperation or madness, but I couldn't just sit and wait for these looping days to devour me. In a moment of shaky resolve, I repeated to myself that I had to gather evidence, find some clue about how to break free. My voice trembled when I muttered those words, sounding almost foreign in the suffocating hush of the cabin. My plan was to set a camera on the living room table, record every bizarre occurrence, and then watch the footage for patterns. When the next cycle began, I felt it immediately. A sudden disorientation, followed by the sensation that the day had reset itself. I looked at the camera screen, and to my astonishment, there was a flicker of time-lapse images. Me pacing the porch, me flipping through that old magazine, me sleeping on the couch, images I didn't recall filming. The timeline jumped erratically, but each segment showed me performing the same actions over and over. More disturbingly, in the background, faint shapes appeared, growing more distinct with each loop. They were tall, thin silhouettes, with elongated arms, their features just outside of focus. My pulse raced as I watched them gather closer, occasionally reaching out in my direction, as though longing to touch me. The loops continued to shrink. Days compacted into hours, hours into minutes. I felt like a marionette, yanked through the same motions, forever tethered to this cursed place. My paranoia spiked to terrifying heights. Every time the cycle restarted, my vision blurred at the edges. The boundary between waking and dreaming dissolved. I would see the walls stretch, the furniture rearrange itself, or the windows warp into impossible shapes. My reflection in the mirror sometimes broke into dozens of fractured images. Each piece gazed back at me with an expression I couldn't recognize. Wide, unblinking eyes filled with silent horror. I felt my own heartbeat pound in my head, so loud it was almost deafening. At times, I heard a voice, not quite human, whisper from behind the walls. It never said a full sentence, just fragments of some alien language. Other times, I thought I heard my own voice echo back at me, but mangled and reversed, as if mocking every attempt I made to break free. The dryness in my mouth intensified, and my throat would tighten as though invisible hands were squeezing my airway. My skin felt clammy, the hair on my arms perpetually raised. I worried that one morning I would wake up and find myself permanently trapped in a single moment, unable to even blink as these interdimensional forces crept ever closer. I realized I was an anchor. The journal had alluded to the cabin drawing people here to serve as a link between the fabric of our reality and that which lurked outside. Whatever was hidden behind the thinning veil needed me, and that knowledge made my stomach twist. They needed a host, a beacon, a point of entry. Every time I existed through another loop, the boundary weakened a fraction more. My presence seemed to accelerate the unraveling, and no matter how often I told myself I wouldn't participate, I couldn't escape the cyclical momentum. My body would move against my will, repeating tasks as if possessed by a script I couldn't rewrite. Panic seized me when I noticed the final stage of the distortion happening right before my eyes. The sky turned a pale gray, shot through with jagged streaks of static, like an old television losing reception. The forest flickered, trees shifting in and out of alignment, creating momentary glimpses of landscapes I couldn't recognize. Frozen tundras, alien deserts, endless seas of black water. Every time the world flickered, my heart jumped, my fingers tingled, and cold sweat trickled down my back. The humming in the air became a roar, vibrating through the windows and walls. I felt unsteady, as though gravity itself was losing its hold on me. Desperate, I remembered the journal's hint about a confrontation. Trembling, and with my heart thundering, I pressed my palms against the cabin wall. I closed my eyes, focusing on the sensation of that rhythmic pounding beneath the wood. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard those interdimensional entities scraping at the edges of reality, testing the tiers I had inadvertently helped create. In a single burst of willpower, fueled by raw terror, I forced myself to challenge the loop. I slammed my fist against the wall and demanded it release me. My voice shook, my lungs burned, but I kept shouting that I would not be their anchor, that I would find a way out. Almost instantly, everything blinked. For a breathless moment, I was suspended in a place of absolute silence and darkness. Then, with a violent lurch, the world around me exploded back into reality. I collapsed onto the cabin floor, gasping for air. My vision swam, and my chest felt like it might burst from the rapid pounding of my heart. Slowly, the shapes around me settled into something close to normal. The walls were no longer throbbing. The sky outside looked clear, the faint glow of sunrise peeking over the horizon. When I checked my phone, I saw it had a signal. The clock on the wall ticked forward in steady, measured seconds. My hands still trembled as I gathered my belongings, stumbling out of the cabin. The forest was quiet, but in a way that felt genuinely serene, as if the world had exhaled a long-held breath. The tension in the air had lifted, though I still felt a near unbearable tightness in my chest. My head throbbed, and sweat soaked the back of my shirt. I could hear my heartbeat echoing in my ears, so loud it nearly drowned out the gentle rustle of the pines. I packed my car in a frantic rush, choking on the fear that if I lingered, I might feel that pull again and be yanked into another loop. The last thing I remember was driving away, watching the cabin's outline shrink in my rearview mirror. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting the horizon to split open or the trees to twist into unnatural shapes once more. My stomach was still in knots, and my breath felt shaky, but part of me sensed that I had broken the cycle, at least for now. And yet I couldn't dismiss the possibility that some piece of that place clung to me, hidden beneath my skin, waiting for the right moment to manifest again. Sometimes at night I can still feel the walls vibrating and hear the wind chimes ringing in that looped sequence. I'm haunted by the sense that time isn't as stable as I'd like to believe, that something out there is just biding its time. I don't know if I truly escaped or if I'm still caught in one last extension of that looping day, allowed to roam freely for a little while before being dragged back. The cabin remains etched in my mind, a permanent question mark in the map of my memories. Even now, when the lights go out and the world falls silent, I wonder if I'm seconds away from hearing those scratching sounds again and feeling that oppressive weight crushing my lungs. Despite telling myself it's all over, I can't help but sense the presence of something just beyond my field of vision, always watching, always waiting for the right moment to breach our fragile reality. Story 10. I remember that night as if I were standing in it still, a suffocating darkness, broken only by the headlights of my car illuminating a lonely stretch of crumbling asphalt. The moon was hidden behind a shroud of heavy clouds, and the air smelled like damp leaves and stagnant water. The feeling was immediate and invasive, a pressure on my chest that made breathing difficult. My hands trembled against the steering wheel, and I was gripped by the certainty that I should not be there. I could not have predicted how right that instinct was, nor how deeply it would haunt me long after I left that deserted road. But at the time, I just wanted to get home. If only I had turned around and taken my chances in the darkness instead of asking for directions from the stranger I found. I had been on a road trip for work, the kind of long-haul drive that stretches into the late hours of the night. I had been dozing off behind the wheel, jolting awake to the rumble of my tires crossing onto the shoulder. When I opened my eyes, I realized I was utterly lost. My GPS had long since lost its signal, and my phone's battery was nearly dead. The only thing I could do was keep driving until I found a gas station or a diner, anything with a sign of life. The engine hummed beneath me, and a chill crept in through the windows, even though I had turned the heating on full blast. Then I spotted him, an old man standing at the roadside, barely visible under a flickering street lamp. He leaned on a crooked walking stick, his silhouette unnaturally rigid. My heart pounded as I pulled over. There's something instinctively alarming about encountering someone alone on a desolate highway in the middle of the night. Everything in me whispered that I shouldn't roll down the window, that I should just drive away. But desperation spoke louder. I needed directions. I managed to ask if he knew how I could get back to the interstate. My voice came out shaky, as though my throat had forgotten how to form words. The old man muttered something in response, only I couldn't understand a single syllable. His lips moved in the sickly glow of the street lamp, and I heard a guttural hum that tightened my stomach in knots. There was a moment of deep unease. He repeated the directions, if that's what they were, again. Then, with a trembling hand, he pointed down the road, into a patch of darkness so dense it seemed to absorb the light from my headlights. I recall little else from that encounter. I know I mumbled something like a thank you, half in a daze, and he responded with the same incomprehensible utterances. I might have seen a faint curve of what could have been a grin on his withered face, or maybe it was just a trick of the light. I felt a sudden surge of nausea, as if vertigo had overtaken me. My eyelids fluttered, and something in my chest constricted. Then everything went black, as if an invisible hand had pressed a switch inside my mind. When I finally woke up, it wasn't in my car. It was in my own bed. My sheets were drenched in sweat, and my ears rang like I had just emerged from a long tunnel. I blinked a few times, disoriented by the sunlight streaming in through the blinds. My heart hammered in my chest, and every muscle felt as though it had been clenched for hours. Initially, I thought I must have dreamed the entire encounter, but a horrified realization landed on me when I glanced at my phone and saw the date. 3 whole days had passed. Panic set in. My pulse spiked, and I struggled to breathe as I flipped through my call log, my messages, anything that could clue me in on what had happened in those missing days. There were no clues. It was as if I had simply disappeared for 3 days, and then reappeared in my own bed. I called colleagues who demanded to know where I'd been. They insisted I was unreachable, and that my disappearance had nearly cost me my job. No one had any explanation. My car was still parked neatly in my driveway, keys in the ignition, as though I had brought it home and locked myself away. But I had no memory of any of that. Soon I noticed other changes. It started with small things. While searching my home for clues, I found a notebook on my kitchen table filled with scribbles that resembled archaic alphabets, complicated curves, lines crossing each other in geometrically impossible patterns. It was my handwriting, the same pressure of the pen I recognized from my daily scribbles. But I had no recollection of writing any of it. After a while, I realized I could read parts of it too, like my brain had effortlessly absorbed some dead language. My head ached whenever I tried to make sense of it, as though the knowledge was forcibly crammed into my skull. Next came the physical marks. At first I thought they were bruises, weird patches that appeared on my forearms and down my torso. But they didn't hurt and didn't behave like normal bruises. Over the next couple of nights they began to spread and merge, forming what looked like lines and circles arranged in a deliberate pattern. Under the bathroom light, I stared at my reflection in shock. These markings came together in shapes that looked uncannily like a constellation or a map of star positions. My pulse thudded loud in my ears, and beads of sweat formed on my forehead. I ran my fingers over the lines, feeling the texture of my skin. It was like they were etched into me. The sensation of it made my stomach churn. As if this wasn't enough to unhinge me, I started having urges. Late at night, I'd feel compelled to drive back to that road. Images of it invaded my dreams. A fractured highway under a moonless sky. A figure standing at the roadside beckoning me forward. I'd snap awake in the middle of the night, drenched in cold sweat, lungs burning as though I'd been holding my breath. During the day, I'd catch myself daydreaming, a whisper in my mind suggesting a specific date, a specific time. And I felt a dread that tasted metallic in my mouth because part of me wanted to obey. Over the following weeks, I grew more and more paranoid. My heart rate would spike whenever my phone rang, fearing it was someone who knew too much or someone speaking in that same language I had heard from the old man. I'd glance over my shoulder when I walked down the street, feeling observed by some invisible presence. My breathing became shallow and ragged, as though my body was constantly bracing for a threat. My reflection in mirrors seemed different. Eyes wide and rimmed with dark circles, like I was becoming someone else. I felt like I was losing control of my own mind. Things reached a breaking point when I noticed that a small portion of the strange writing I'd scribbled down earlier matched inscriptions on ancient artifacts pictured in some old library books. Feeling half-crazed, I visited the local university library and found a dusty volume detailing obscure cults and lost civilizations. The words on those yellowed pages echoed the nonsensical directions the old man had given me. A cold sweat trickled down my neck as I realized I could partially translate them. They spoke of a traveler or a conductor, someone chosen to guide an ancient cosmic force from one realm to another. It was nonsense, yet I understood it with a growing clarity that gnawed at my sanity. I started having constant nightmares, or perhaps they were visions. My chest would feel tight, my breathing uneven, and my limbs would quake as I dreamed of standing on that road again. Only this time the stars overhead were arranged in the same pattern that had etched itself onto my skin. It felt like the sky was pressing down on me, a suffocating blanket of pitch black. And there, behind me, I sensed a presence I dared not turn around to face. My heart pounded so violently, it woke me before I could see what lurked in the darkness. Then the day approached, the one I had scrawled over and over again in my notes. A date circled so heavily that the page was practically torn. I felt that pull growing stronger, a need so overwhelming it manifested as physical pain. My chest tightened like a vice, and I struggled for breath whenever I tried to ignore it. By then, the bruise-like marks had spread across my back, connecting with the ones on my arms, forming a sprawling cosmic diagram. Every time I looked at them in the mirror, my throat went dry, and my body trembled with an unspoken dread. It felt like the blueprint of something infinite and cruel had embedded itself into my flesh. Despite my fear, I realized I wouldn't find any peace unless I followed that impulse. On the marked night, I got into my car. My hands shook on the steering wheel, and I felt a film of cold sweat forming on my forehead. The seatbelt pressed against my rapidly beating heart. The drive out there was strangely quiet. No other cars on the road, no animals scurrying in the darkness. Even the wind had stilled, as though the entire world was holding its breath. When I neared that lonely stretch of highway, the sky was unbelievably clear. Stars glinted like icy shards in a black void, and my arms itched under my sleeves as though the marks were awakening. I saw the same broken street lamp and felt my stomach twist into a knot. My breathing quickened, and my hands went clammy. A faint sense of vertigo threatened to overtake me again, just like it had that first night. I parked the car and cut the engine, leaving myself in a silence so profound it felt like I'd gone deaf. My heart hammered, and my lungs struggled for air, as though something was sucking the oxygen right out of me. A presence was there. I felt it. I couldn't see anyone, but I sensed the old man, or what he represented. This time, though, I wasn't merely lost. I was beckoned. With trembling steps, I got out of the car. My breath formed wispy clouds in the cold night air. The quiet was shattered by the sudden crunch of gravel under my shoes, a noise that startled me. I peered around, scanning the horizon. It felt like the entire landscape was out of joint. The moon was absent, but the stars overhead seemed to pulse in strange patterns, matching the rhythmic pounding in my chest. My skin crawled with an awareness I had never experienced before. The marks on my skin began to glow, just faintly, so faint that I questioned whether I was imagining it. I lifted my sleeve and saw a dim luminescence on my arm, the lines forming shapes I now knew were constellations, ancient star maps. A wave of dizziness swept over me, and I nearly collapsed. Then I sensed something behind me. I still don't know if it was truly there or just in my mind, but I felt a presence tower over me. Something ancient and vast, like a cosmic force compressed into a single point on that wretched highway. My mouth went dry, and my limbs quaked with primal terror. My breathing turned ragged, each inhale feeling like shards of ice clawing at my throat. I recalled the notes about a traveler or conductor for an ancient entity, and I realized with a stab of cold fear that it was me. That role was mine, and I had been marked. My body was the gateway. Yet, in the suffocating intensity of that moment, I clung to a desperate, instinctive refusal. I summoned every ounce of willpower to resist, to break the connection. My mind raged against the assault, telling myself that I was still a man, still a human being, not a vessel for some force I couldn't even name. I screamed, an inhuman, choked cry that echoed across the deserted road. My lungs burned, and my muscles tensed until they felt like they might snap. In that heartbeat of defiance, I felt the presence recede, not gone but momentarily shaken, like a wave pulling back before a greater surge. My vision blurred, and my ears rang with a violent, high-pitched tone. Before I knew it, I was on my knees, panting in the dirt, my face slick with sweat. I half expected to find the old man's withered face inches from mine, but no one was there. Just me, trembling and alone under the cold starlight. I don't remember driving home. Everything becomes fragmented after that. I recall bursts of headlights flashing across the roadside trees, and I recall the pounding of my heart that refused to slow. When I finally woke in my bed the next afternoon, I had no idea how much time had passed. My body ached, and I felt as though I'd run a marathon. The marks on my arms had faded just a bit, still visible but much less pronounced. It was as if that night had siphoned off some part of me, but I remained alive, still myself, at least mostly. I wish I could say I found answers or a way to remove these marks that bind me to that entity. But the truth is, I live in a state of restless vigilance. I keep the lights on, double lock my doors at night, and leave the radio playing static to break the silence. Though the date has passed, I sense it's not truly over. In my dreams, I stand again on that cursed highway, listening to the low hum of that incomprehensible language, feeling my heart thunder in my chest like it's trying to escape my ribcage. My body trembles, sweat drips from my brow, and the cosmic map carved into my flesh glows with an otherworldly light. I survived that night, but I don't know how long I can stave off the pull. Sometimes I sense the presence lurking just beyond my vision. I'll be sitting in my living room and the lights will flicker. My skin prickles with an electric dread. My breath catches, and I struggle to slow my racing pulse. In those moments, I hear the old man's voice in my mind, chanting in that inhuman tongue, telling me I was chosen, telling me there is no escape from an ageless destiny. Yet I fight. I cling to the rhythms of daily life, hoping that by maintaining some semblance of normalcy, going to work, buying groceries, paying bills, I can keep that ancient force at bay. The mania still creeps in around the edges. The lines on my skin sometimes pulsate when I stare at them too long, and that suffocating sense of being watched never fully subsides. But I'm still here, still breathing, still capable of slamming that door shut when I feel my will slipping. I have no illusions that I'm free. Whatever that being was, it has rooted itself in my flesh and mind, and someday it might call again. But until that happens, I live in uneasy defiance, heart beating fast whenever I think of that lonely road. The memory of the old man, his eerie mutterings, and those lost 3 days are a constant reminder that some horrors slip through the cracks of our world. The tension of not knowing when or if I'll be summoned again is its own kind of nightmare. So I lock my door, check my windows, and keep one eye on the sky. Because when I close my eyes, I still see the map inscribed on my skin, beckoning me. The stars overhead shine as though they remember me, remember my role. And every night, I pray that I can hold on to my sanity for one more day, because the footsteps on that abandoned highway still echo in my ears, and I know that some things, once awakened, never truly sleep. Story 11. I could sense something was wrong the instant the rusted signpost came into view. The air along the winding road felt dense and humid, clinging to my skin like a cold sweat. Everything around me was far too still. No chirping birds, no distant hum of passing cars. Just oppressive silence and the faint smell of damp earth. It was as if the world was holding its breath. And there, standing in the middle of that unsettling hush, was the sign for a town I'd never heard of. Large letters in chipped paint, welcoming us to a place that seemed to materialize from the gloom itself. My friend Marcus and I had been traveling together for a few days, taking a road trip on a whim. We were looking for a reprieve from our routine, chasing new experiences across back roads and small towns. Neither of us expected to stumble upon a village that shouldn't be on any map. Yet there it was, perched at the end of a long, empty street. A cluster of old buildings that seemed to flicker in and out of existence, as if caught between this world and another. I parked on a narrow shoulder, feeling uneasy the moment I shut off the engine. The silence roared in my ears. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding, and my breath felt jagged in my throat. I noticed Marcus shift in his seat, and he muttered something about the atmosphere being weird. Though he kept his voice low, I caught the tremor in his words. It wasn't exactly fear, more like a deep-rooted anxiety, the kind that creeps in when all your instincts are telling you to turn back. But we decided to investigate, driven by a mixture of curiosity and adrenaline. We walked toward the town. Each step on the cracked asphalt sounded painfully loud, and I kept expecting someone to appear in a window or on a porch. No one did, at least not immediately. The buildings looked like they were lifted from some lost era. Faded signs, broken shutters, a single lantern swaying in the breeze. I felt as though unseen eyes were following us, making every hair on my neck stand at attention. My stomach twisted. The taste of metal filled my mouth, and I realized I was grinding my teeth. At the heart of this settlement stood a small square with a dry fountain in its center. Crumbling stone benches surrounded the fountain, and the entire place smelled of wet concrete and rotting timber. Marcus and I exchanged uneasy glances. We sensed that we weren't supposed to be there, yet it felt like the town had lured us, beckoning with some intangible promise of dark wonders. He quietly suggested that the place might be abandoned, but I noticed faint hints of habitation. A flicker of movement in a window at the far end of the street, a door left slightly ajar as if someone had been expecting us. It became clear that people lived here. But why were they hiding? And why did the whole place make my skin crawl like I was trespassing on forbidden ground? We ventured deeper, keeping our voices down. My lungs felt tight, and I had to remind myself to breathe properly. The gloom grew thicker as the sky overhead turned a murky gray. I looked back at our car, parked near the entrance, and realized I could barely see it anymore through an inexplicable haze. It dawned on me that if I tried to run back, I might lose my way. The streets stretched and twisted as though the town itself were shifting behind our backs. I began to wonder if we had gotten turned around, or if we were imagining details we'd just seen. Marcus murmured that he thought he recognized a particular store facade from a different direction, as if we'd circled around without noticing. Yet we both swore we'd walked a straight line. My heart raced faster, and cold perspiration gathered on my forehead. A bizarre notion wormed its way into my mind. This town was toying with us, bending and unfolding at will, trapping us like insects in a maze. When we finally encountered one of the residents, it happened so suddenly that my pulse nearly exploded in my chest. A tall figure in a long coat emerged from a side alley. The way he moved set off alarms in my head. His steps were almost mechanical, like he was stepping through the motions of a half-forgotten dance. He looked at us with eyes that didn't seem to focus. I was too startled to speak, and Marcus just stood there, swallowing hard. The man motioned for us to follow him, a gesture that felt rehearsed, as though he'd done it countless times for countless visitors. Without words, he led us toward a small building that might have once been a general store. Inside, the air was stale, and a single weak light bulb swayed from the ceiling. I felt every nerve in my body on edge, hyper-aware of each flicker of the bulb. The man mumbled something about the city appearing and disappearing, though his voice sounded like it came from a great distance. He said it existed everywhere and nowhere, skipping across time and space. He spoke about how the townspeople were stuck in an endless cycle, with only fragments of memory about their condition. It was only afterward, when I tried to recall our talk, that I realized I couldn't remember his exact words. They felt more like vague impressions seared into my mind. The man drifted away, and we were left alone in the store. A layer of dust coated the counters and shelves, except for a single pathway that seemed recently swept. I felt a growing sense of claustrophobia, as if the walls were inching closer. My throat went dry, and a wave of dizziness came over me. I struggled to focus on the shapes of items strewn around. A rusted cash register, cans with labels too faded to read, a battered clock stuck at 3:17. The room smelled of mold and something acrid that made my eyes water. Marcus gestured for us to leave, his breath coming out in short gasps. I agreed, moving as quietly as I could. Outside, the sky had darkened even more. I had no sense of time anymore. Everything seemed to float in a haze. We passed a row of old houses, each more dilapidated than the last. But occasionally, I glimpsed something inside a window, a reflection of my own fears staring back at me. Once I thought I saw my childhood home, but it dissolved into the weather-beaten boards as soon as I blinked. My heart pounded against my ribcage. I felt I was losing my grip on reality. Marcus began to fret about not remembering the way we came. He wondered if we should just pick a direction and run, but I was terrified of the thought that this place might rearrange itself again, leading us into an endless labyrinth. I felt a painful tightness in my chest, accompanied by shallow gulps of air that didn't seem to fill my lungs. My palms were clammy, and I had to wipe them on my jeans just to maintain a semblance of composure. An older resident appeared around the corner. They looked at us with a distant confusion, as if we were phantoms who had interrupted their routine. In halting words, they conveyed that the city moved as it pleased, drawing in outsiders whose fears and memories fueled the illusions around us. They warned us that the city thrived on that fear, shaping itself to match the terrors we carried. I felt my blood run cold. It was as if the walls and streets were living pages of my darkest thoughts, adapting and morphing with every anxious beat of my heart. I began to notice that the windows reflected not just the two of us, but scenes from my past. A hospital corridor where I once stood trembling under fluorescent lights, an abandoned playground where I'd felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. Each vision twisted my stomach into knots, reminding me of vulnerabilities I tried to bury long ago. My breathing grew ragged, and I felt small tremors running through my arms and legs. The sense of being watched became unbearable. Every sound, A creaking plank, a distant footstep, sent jolts of electricity through my veins. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting some shape to materialize at my back. Marcus tried to keep us focused on finding an exit, using fragments of logic to guide us away from the center of this haunted maze. He kept reminding me that we needed to stay calm, that panic would only feed the illusions. But I could see the tension etched into his forehead and the way he clenched his fists. We turned corner after corner, sometimes stumbling back into the same courtyard with that cracked fountain, as if the city itself were mocking our attempt to leave. Eventually, we slipped into a narrow passage between two decrepit buildings. The alley was cramped, lined with soggy boxes and broken crates. The smell of rotting cardboard churned my stomach, and I had to gulp back nausea. Something skittered in the darkness. A rat, perhaps, or something far less ordinary. My heart hammered in my ears as we squeezed through, determined to find any path that might lead us out of the main streets. On the other side, we found ourselves behind a row of houses we hadn't seen before, each with cracked windows and sagging roofs. The air felt heavier here, tinged with the faint scent of sulfur. I heard a distant humming, too low and irregular to be electrical. My scalp prickled with unease. Marcus pointed to a faint glow at the horizon, suggesting it might be the way out. We moved quickly, every step accompanied by the rustle of gravel underfoot and our own labored breathing. As we pressed on, I became aware of shapes moving at the edges of my vision. They vanished whenever I tried to look at them directly, leaving only vague silhouettes that gnawed at my nerves. My muscles ached from tension, and a dull throbbing began behind my eyes. We continued walking until the glow revealed itself to be nothing more than a flickering street lamp teetering on the verge of going dark. Something about that street lamp made my pulse quicken. It felt too familiar, like a memory pulled from my subconscious. The flickering light cast wild shadows on the walls around us, creating grotesque figures that danced and loomed. The hum in the air rose to a maddening pitch, making the back of my neck tingle. Marcus noticed that the lamp's number matched the one outside his old apartment building, a place that held uneasy memories for him. We stared at each other, sharing a terrifying realization. This town was reaching into our minds and bending physical reality to echo our deepest fears. I felt a sharp pain behind my eyes, as if my own thoughts were being pried open. The shadows under the street lamp took on fluid forms, swirling and coalescing. My breath caught in my throat. The next moment it was gone, replaced by an ordinary pool of dim light. But my nerves were shot, and I could feel the sweat on my back, chilling me every time a faint breeze passed by. Without warning, an echoing voice called from somewhere in the darkness, telling us there was a way out if we could resist the illusions. It sounded like an old recording, warped and scratchy, as though the message had been replayed over centuries. The words were so faint I wasn't sure if they were spoken aloud or just formed in my head. In any case, I latched onto them. With my heart hammering in my chest, I told Marcus we needed to concentrate on what was real. The texture of the pavement under our shoes, the smell of the musty air, and the faint sting of wind on our faces. Clinging to these concrete sensations was our best chance to anchor ourselves. At first it felt futile. The city seemed determined to twist our path, leading us in circles and subjecting us to more disturbing reflections from our past. I almost lost hope when I saw a house that bore an exact resemblance to the place I had grown up in. Its porch steps even had the same crack on the third plank. I felt my pulse surge, and for a second my surroundings went hazy. My mouth went dry and a cold sweat dripped down my neck. But I recalled the warning: focus on what's real. So I forced myself to touch the splintered wood of the fence, to feel the rough edges pricking my palm. I reminded myself that this was an illusion meant to trap me. Marcus kept his gaze forward, muttering under his breath that we needed to keep walking, no matter what. We found a diagonal street that seemed to slice through the grid of endless roads. The buildings there were unfinished or partially transparent, as if the city hadn't fully formed them. Through the gaps, I glimpsed rolling hills and a patch of normal sky. My heart leapt. We quickened our pace, ignoring the stifling pressure that pushed against our chests with each step. I could sense the town resisting, like a living entity fighting to hold us in. The ground seemed to shift beneath our feet, and the streetlights flickered in erratic patterns. The air had become so thick that I struggled to breathe, feeling each intake of oxygen like an uphill climb. My vision blurred at the edges, and I forced myself to stay focused. Every muscle in my body screamed for rest, but I refused to stop. Marcus was right beside me, his eyes wide with resolve and terror in equal measure. After what felt like hours, we burst out of the labyrinth and onto a deserted road under a sky that was beginning to lighten. The transition was so abrupt that we stumbled over ourselves. One moment, we were in that claustrophobic maze. The next, we stood in an open space with a faint sunrise coloring the horizon. My heart hammered so loudly I could feel the pulsations in my ears. I doubled over, trying to catch my breath, trembling from head to toe. Marcus pointed behind us. I followed his gaze and saw nothing but empty asphalt stretching into the distance. The entire town, if it still existed, was hidden behind a gray morning mist. My mind spun with disbelief and a lingering sense of dread. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just stood there gasping for air, drenched in sweat, hearts on the verge of bursting. My skin felt clammy, and I could still smell that cloying odor of decay lingering in my nostrils. We walked back to where we had left our car. Miraculously, it was still there, though the road looked slightly different than before, as if the landscape had reassembled itself in our absence. Marcus fumbled with the keys, and we climbed into the car, letting the engine rumble to life. The headlights cut through the pale dawn, revealing an empty stretch of highway. No welcome sign, no proof that the place we'd just escaped from had ever existed. Neither of us could fully shake the horrifying sense that the town was still watching us, somewhere out there, or that it might appear again in our path without warning. The interior of the car felt like a flimsy shield against the greater unknown. As we drove, I tried to convince myself that we were safe now, but my heart stubbornly refused to slow. My thoughts were still tangled in the images of that impossible place, its cracked fountain, its ghostly inhabitants, its cruel ability to transform itself into a living nightmare fueled by our own fears. I can't say we were ever the same after that. The boundaries of reality and illusion seemed forever blurred. Every deserted road we passed in the days that followed brought back a surge of panic, a fear that we'd round a bend and see that sign again. Sometimes, late at night, I replay those moments in my head, feeling my pulse rise just at the memory. I wonder if the town has reappeared for someone else, bending itself into their personal horrors. Or maybe it's lurking in every dark corner of the world, ready to materialize for those who stray too far off the beaten path. I don't know for certain what happened to us in that strange settlement, or why it chose to reveal itself at that moment, but the experience left me forever changed. A raw nerve exposed to the universe's cruel possibilities. Even now, as I write this, I can sense the echo of that oppressive hush, recall the stifled air, and the trembling panic in my limbs. The memory lingers like a sickness, flaring up whenever I allow my mind to wander. And though I keep telling myself it's over, I still catch myself peering into dimly lit corners, half expecting to see flickering buildings and figures from a time-looped nightmare. Because deep down I suspect that once this place chooses you, it never really lets you go. Story 12. I felt it the moment I stepped onto the damp soil. Something was watching. The air clung to me like a humid shroud, and the thin mist slithering around my ankles felt almost alive. I could taste the tension, thick and acrid, at the back of my throat. My heart thudded in my ears, a quickening drumbeat that set the tone for everything that would follow. I had no inkling of the horror waiting just beyond the boundary of my ordinary perception, nor did I realize how deeply these encounters would scar me. But from that very first night, I should have known I was crossing a threshold into a place where reason frays and primal fear takes over. I'm a biologist, and my work sometimes sends me to remote locations to document wildlife behavior. When I arrived at an isolated forest reserve 3 months ago, the atmosphere struck me as unsettling, though I couldn't pinpoint why. It's not that the place was outwardly menacing. On the surface, it was a tranquil woodland, replete with thick clusters of moss-covered trunks, the occasional rustling of small creatures in the underbrush, and a canopy so dense it blocked out most direct sunlight. Yet beneath that natural facade, something felt warped, like a note played off-key, resonating just enough to make you shiver. I tried to shrug off my unease as simple nerves. New environments can be overwhelming, and I had plenty of research tasks to occupy my mind. For the first few days, I focused on observing deer. They were the primary subject of my study in this particular reserve. Everything seemed normal until one evening. The sun was barely a sliver in the sky, and darkness seeped through the trees much faster than I anticipated. I heard what I thought were heavy footsteps in the distance, an uneven scraping that made my neck prickle with tension. My pulse began to race. A wave of cold sweat formed on my forehead, and my mouth went dry. When I finally saw them, I almost dismissed it as a trick of the moonlight. 3 deer, walking in a single line through the undergrowth. Only they didn't move quite right. Their limbs bent at unnatural angles, as though their joints had been rearranged. Each step looked stilted, like a marionette pulled by clumsy strings. My stomach churned, and a tremor passed through my fingers, forcing me to grip a nearby tree trunk for support. I whispered to myself that maybe they were injured or afflicted by some rare disease. I even closed my eyes for a second, hoping the illusion would fade. It didn't. As I watched, one of the deer twisted its neck to look at me. The movement was too deliberate, too calculating for a wild animal. My breath caught in my throat, and my heart hammered so loudly I was sure it would burst. The deer's eyes locked on mine, and time seemed to stretch. I had the distinct impression it recognized me, not just saw me, but acknowledged me as if peering right into my thoughts. My chest tightened, and my skin prickled. Then, just as abruptly as it happened, the creature turned away. The 3 of them resumed their odd march into the shadows, leaving me trembling, with sweat beading at my temples. I spent the next day convincing myself I'd misinterpreted a natural phenomenon, that I was merely exhausted. I discussed the situation with a colleague over the phone, though I kept it vague. I said I'd seen strange behavior in the deer, hoping that simpler language might stop my mind from conjuring more sinister explanations. Yet I couldn't shake the memory of those unnatural limbs, and the way one of them had turned its head as if it knew me. My heart still pounded every time I replayed that image in my mind. About a week later, I was assigned to examine some aquatic life in a nearby lake, a still body of water known for its algae population. The path leading down to the lake was narrow, bordered by tall reeds that whispered softly in the breeze. The late afternoon sun filtered through the thick canopy overhead, casting angular shadows that danced across the ground. Each rustling branch sent a mild jolt of anxiety through my body. My breathing felt shallow, and I could sense myself becoming hyper-aware of every sound. A twig snapping behind me, the distant flapping of bird wings, and the soft squelch of my boots against the muddy earth. When I reached the shore, the lake's surface was glassy, reflecting the skeletal outlines of leafless branches overhead. It seemed calm, almost frozen in time. As I crouched to collect a water sample, I noticed a faint ripple out near the center of the lake. My stomach knotted because the water around me was utterly still. No wind disturbed the reeds, and I didn't see any fish breaking the surface. The ripple, slow and methodical, spread out in concentric circles, as though something vast and ancient had exhaled beneath the lake's surface. I moved closer, heart thudding against my ribs, my hands trembling so much I spilled some of the water I was trying to collect. I tried to peer into the murky depths, straining to make out any shape or movement. For a moment, I caught sight of something darker than the surrounding water. It felt more like a presence than an animal. The hairs on my arms stood on end, and my breath came in shallow bursts. Then the ripple stilled, vanishing as if it had never existed. I tried to tell myself it was just a large fish or maybe a submerged log shifting, but my entire body hummed with dread. Something about that moment felt impossibly old, as though an ancient awareness had brushed against my consciousness, marking me somehow. The real terror, though, came a couple of weeks afterward. I was finishing up my nightly observations, documenting changes in nocturnal insect behavior. The moon was high, casting a silvery glow through the branches. My steps crunched on dry leaves, and every sound, a distant owl's hoot, the rustle of a small mammal, made my heart flinch. My nerves were on edge like a taut wire ready to snap. That's when I noticed a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was a tall tree stump. Then it moved. It stood impossibly straight, draped in a long, dark coat that merged into the night. A high-crowned top hat perched on its head. My chest constricted, and my legs threatened to buckle beneath me. I could feel my pulse racing in my temples, a frantic drumming that made it hard to think. I forced myself to blink, to breathe, convinced I was hallucinating from stress. But the figure remained. An overwhelming sensation of being prey washed over me. The presence exuded a hunger that made the air feel stifling, nearly suffocating me. I could sense its attention on me, as tangible as a hand around my throat. My body began to tremble, and cold sweat trickled down my back. In a shaky whisper, I tried to call out, but my voice failed me. My mouth was so dry it felt like sandpaper. Then, as though responding to my attempt at speech, it stepped forward. Its movement was fluid, too precise, and it made no sound. I stumbled back a few steps, almost losing my balance on a gnarled root that jutted from the ground. I expected it to lunge or vanish. Instead, it just stood there, letting me see its silhouette in unnerving detail. Despite the dim moonlight, I had the impression of long, bony fingers clasped against its sides, and the glint of eyes that observed me with an unsettling calm. I don't remember how I made it back to my cabin that night. My mind spins with fragments of memory, the pounding of my feet on the dirt trail, branches whipping across my arms and leaving stinging scratches, my own panicked gasps. Once inside, I locked the door and switched on every light. I collapsed onto my cot, my heartbeat still racing. I wanted to scream, but I was so drained that I could only sit there, rocking back and forth as wave after wave of panic pulsed through me. From that day on, my life changed in ways I still struggle to explain. I began noticing things that I had never perceived before. Faint ripples in the air at the edges of my vision, fleeting shapes just beyond my line of sight, subtle patterns in how shadows fell across the walls. I'd see random bursts of color shimmering in corners like living auroras. My brain felt as though it was being rewired to detect layers of reality that most people never sense. My colleagues noticed the strain etched on my face, but when they asked if I was all right, I replied indirectly that I was simply overworked. All the while, a heavy sense of dread filled me, like I was waiting for an impact that never came. My sleeping hours dwindled. The slightest sound startled me awake, heart hammering against my ribs, sweat coating my skin. I felt watched, even within my own cabin. My reflection in the mirror sometimes appeared delayed or distorted, as though the glass was a portal to somewhere else. Eventually, patterns started to make sense, or what passed for sense in my rattled mind. I realized there was a system at play, one that existed beneath our ordinary comprehension. I began to suspect these entities feed on emotions. I'd walk through the forest and feel pulses of anxiety emanating from certain clearings, as though something had left a psychic residue behind. And I suspected that, ever since those 3 encounters, I'd become a host to one of those beings. The tingling I felt beneath my skin, the heightened senses, the endless paranoia. These weren't mere symptoms of anxiety. It was as if something had latched onto me, using me as a conduit to enter our world. There were moments I wanted to tear off my own clothes and scratch at my skin, just to rid myself of the sensation that something invisible was coiled inside me. My breathing was perpetually shallow, my heart never fully at rest. At times, I could almost hear a subtle clicking in my head, like an ancient language whispering just beneath my conscious thoughts. If I managed to drift into half-sleep, I'd have vivid nightmares of tall figures in top hats stalking me through moonlit groves, or sets of twisted deer eyes staring from all directions, silent but accusatory. In my more lucid hours, I tried to keep working. I took notes on the local flora, measured water chemistry, and set camera traps in the woods. But each moment felt tainted by the presence I carried. If the camera footage revealed anything unusual, I never had the nerve to watch it alone. I'd quickly glance at the screen, my stomach churning, half expecting to see that tall figure leering at the lens. My colleagues would ask questions, though mostly they spoke in hushed tones near me. I'd respond with half-truths. Stress, nightmares, the pressure of deadlines. Inside, I was convinced that if I revealed the truth, I'd be labeled delusional, or worse, I'd become more isolated, right when I was desperate for any sense of normalcy. Over time, I became convinced these entities work together, an interdimensional ecosystem feeding on human fear, anxiety, and doubt. Perhaps they shift between realms, using our world as a vast hunting ground, and I, unwittingly, had been singled out. My repeated exposures to them had opened my mind, making me more receptive to their presence. I was both a resource and a liability, a living beacon they could use to expand their territory. My final night in that reserve, I decided I couldn't stay there anymore. My nerves were shot. I planned my departure with methodical care, packing only essentials, leaving behind anything I couldn't carry easily. The air outside was thick and muggy. Each breath felt like I was swallowing liquid fear. Every step through the forest was torture. Twigs snapped underfoot like distant echoes of my pounding heart. My skin tingled with the constant anticipation of seeing that tall figure again. But I didn't see him, nor did I see the deer or sense the ripple in the lake. Instead, I felt them all around me, an invisible chorus of watchers, silently tracking my progress. My body was slick with sweat, adrenaline coursing through my veins. My lungs burned from shallow, rapid breaths. The shadows seemed to shift, occasionally forming spindly shapes that flitted away when I turned my head. I reached my vehicle parked at the edge of the reserve and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so violently that I nearly dropped them. When the engine roared to life, I felt a surge of relief so intense that it brought tears to my eyes. Yet as I pulled away, the forest's darkness pressed in closer than ever, as though something was making a final attempt to keep hold of me. Driving away, I didn't see any figures in my rearview mirror. There were no unnatural deer bounding across the road. There was no cosmic ripple breaking the stillness of a lake. But the oppressive weight on my chest didn't vanish. I felt it, and I continue to feel it. This impression that I'm carrying something inside me. It's as though a tunnel now connects me to that other realm, an ever-present corridor through which I sense them prowling. Even in the safety of my own home, I can't escape the occasional glimpse of those shimmering anomalies at the edges of my vision. The tall man in the top hat visits me in dreams, his silent face obscured by darkness, yet somehow radiating an ageless appetite. I suspect these creatures can move in and out of our dimension with minimal effort, and maybe, just maybe, they have me to thank for that ease of access. Sometimes I feel their quiet exultation. It's in the tingling along my spine, the subtle tightening of my scalp, the growing paranoia that never quite fades. I'm surviving, if you can call it that, but I'm forever changed. I left that reserve, but it hasn't left me. Even now, my heart pounds whenever I think about what I encountered. My hands tremble when I recall the twisted movements of those deer, the ancient presence in that silent lake, and the inhuman poise of the man in the top hat. I've come to a disturbing revelation. I'm a conduit, possibly the first of many. There's an entire ecosystem lurking behind the veneer of our reality, and each day I feel it drawing closer. The boundary between their world and ours has worn thinner, and I can't stop my mind from replaying every terrifying sign I ignored. I still have nightmares, though calling them nightmares doesn't do justice to the intensity. They feel more like a second life, one where I'm eternally hunted, lost in some labyrinth of towering trees and bottomless lakes. When I wake, my heart threatens to tear free from my chest, and my sheets are soaked with sweat. I stagger to the mirror sometimes, half expecting to see a spidery silhouette in the background, or my reflection staring back with eyes that aren't entirely my own. I've had to accept that this isn't over. My perspective on reality has been irrevocably warped. Perhaps I can run, but I can't hide from what I've seen, because it exists all around us. The only difference now is that I notice the subtle flickers and the faint shifts in the atmosphere. I feel them feeding on my anxieties, sensing my vulnerability. I'm determined to stay vigilant, to live with this knowledge, no matter how oppressive it feels. But that silent dread, that lingering chill, remains. It thrives in my chest, resonates in my nightmares, and prowls at the edges of my waking life. And I fear that this might just be the beginning. Story 13. I still remember the way my skin prickled the very first night I sensed that presence looming just out of sight. It was like feeling a sudden chill in the dead of summer. No breeze, no open window, yet every hair on my neck stood at attention. I had just arrived home from work, my head pounding from a long day, and the hallway leading to my bedroom seemed darker than usual. The silence was not comforting but suffocating, and in that silent tension, I felt as if something in the shadows had been waiting for my return. Even before I turned on the light, my heart was already hammering in my chest. The emptiness of that corridor pressed against my senses, warning me that I was no longer alone. My name is Victor. I share this cramped old apartment with another guy named Adam. We're both trying to survive in a city that feels like it takes more than it ever gives. The place isn't glamorous. The walls are scuffed. The paint is peeling in some corners, and the floorboards creak like an old ship at sea whenever we so much as shift our weight. Despite its flaws, it had always felt familiar and safe, until a few weeks ago, when everything started to change. Initially, I brushed off the unsettling moments as stress-induced hallucinations. Late at night, as I made my way down the hallway, I would see the outline of a figure lurking beyond the corner. At first glance, it appeared tall and unnaturally thin, with shoulders that seemed too angular for any ordinary person. But every time I tried to look directly at it, the shape would be gone, leaving only the echo of my own footsteps. My breathing would tighten, and a quiver would run down my spine, but I forced myself to believe I was imagining things. After all, Adam never mentioned anything. It couldn't be real, right? Soon enough, I learned Adam was experiencing something very similar, though he didn't tell me until later. It started with me casually remarking on a strange dream one morning over a hurried breakfast. I described an endless corridor lined with flickering lights that I somehow knew was our own hallway, only it stretched on forever. I mentioned seeing a tall, shifting shadow drifting near the far end, feeling certain it was watching me. Adam stared at me with a pallid face and muttered that he had dreamed about the same corridor. He said nothing more, but the way he clenched his coffee mug until his knuckles went white told me all I needed to know. We were sharing the same nightmare. In the days that followed, I found myself more and more on edge. Strange noises began to fill the apartment at odd hours, barely audible scraping sounds in the walls or a distant clicking noise in the middle of the night. The overhead lights in the hallway started to flicker whenever I walked beneath them. Sometimes when I flipped the switch, the light would surge too brightly for a moment, almost painfully blinding, and then dim back down to its normal lackluster glow. My pulse would race each time I entered that space, as though some primal fear in me was screaming that I was trespassing. Adam and I exchanged notes on our individual experiences in a subdued way. We didn't sit down for an official conversation, so much as compare details whenever we passed in the hallway or crossed paths in the kitchen. He mentioned that sometimes, late at night, he sensed a presence behind him as he went to the bathroom. He would whip around, heart pounding, only to discover nobody there. Other times, he would catch a glimpse of a towering silhouette in his peripheral vision, only to blink and find nothing. Our shared experiences unnerved me more than anything else. There was something fundamentally wrong with both of us seeing and feeling the same things. Rationally, I tried to chalk it up to suggestion, to the power of the mind. But the feeling of being watched was so tangible, it made my throat go dry and my stomach twist. Then the dreams became more vivid. I had always been interested in lucid dreaming, though I rarely achieved it for more than a fleeting moment. But about a week after we discovered we were having parallel nightmares, I found myself fully lucid in that same endless hallway. I knew I was asleep, yet everything around me felt painstakingly real. the cold air brushing against my arms, the musty smell of old paint, the electric hum from overhead fixtures. As I walked, I could feel the hardwood floor beneath my feet, every creak magnified in the oppressive stillness. And at the far end of the corridor was that shape, tall, impossibly dark, with elongated limbs and a face that seemed devoid of features. I remember my heart thudding so violently I worried my chest might give out. Sweat rolled down my temple and my vision blurred with anxiety, but still I approached it. Just as I got close enough to discern any details on its face, I heard a sound like wind rustling through dead leaves. The figure's head tilted in an unnatural, jerking motion, and I realized it wasn't just looking at me. It was aware of me. In that moment, the lights in the hallway surged again, flickering violently. My stomach lurched with nausea as the walls themselves seemed to bend and twist. Then, mercifully, I woke up. I could still feel my pulse pounding in my throat, the bed sheets damp against my clammy skin. The next morning, Adam looked pale and shaken. He didn't say much, but he let slip that he, too, had been lucid in his nightmare. His dream had ended around the same time as mine, with the same corridor warping uncontrollably. We realized that somehow, we were sharing the same space in our dreams. Our random glimpses of each other in that endless hallway only confirmed it. From that point on, reality itself began to blur. The walls of our actual apartment started showing subtle changes that were difficult to articulate. Certain cracks in the paint seemed deeper, almost like tiny crevices that went beyond the surface. The flickering of the lights became a daily occurrence. Shadows in the corners grew longer, as if the geometry of the rooms was stretching. I felt a creeping dread each time I stepped into the hallway. Breathing in that narrow space was laborious, like a weight pressed against my chest. I could swear the air smelled stale, tinged with a faint metallic scent that made me uneasy. My encounters with that tall figure grew more frequent, not only in dreams but also in those borderline states between sleeping and waking. Sometimes, I'd jolt awake at 3 a.m., convinced I saw someone standing in the doorway. Other times I'd be half asleep on the couch, and I'd feel a lightness in my limbs as though I was drifting off, only to sense that presence behind me. I'd jump up, panting and sweating, heart thrashing against my ribs. The apartment itself was no longer a place of rest. It had become a place of vigilant watchfulness. Adam tried to research what was happening. He scrolled through obscure forums, reading about shadow people, interdimensional visitors, and other bizarre theories. He mentioned to me that some texts described entities trapped between worlds, feeding off people's energy in the borderlands of consciousness. I didn't want to believe any of it, but the rational part of my mind was coming up short with explanations. I simply knew that something was terribly wrong, and each day it felt like we were losing a bit more of our grip on reality. One especially harrowing night, I decided to confront the figure in a lucid dream. I practiced techniques to maintain lucidity, counting my fingers, focusing on a fixed point until everything sharpened into clarity. When I finally drifted off, I found myself in that stretched corridor again. I felt cold sweat sliding down my back, my heart pounding so hard I was almost dizzy with fear. I forced myself to keep walking, each step echoing loudly until I reached the silhouette. Adam was also there, just behind the figure, or maybe only a reflection in the flickering lights. Through the oppressive darkness, I sensed a chaotic energy pulsating from the entity, a slow but relentless force that seemed to tear at the edges of my consciousness. I demanded to know what it wanted, though my voice emerged as a trembling echo in the corridor. Its head twitched, and in a motion that blurred my vision, the figure shifted closer. It was then I understood, not through words, but through a profound awareness that flooded my mind. It was trapped between dimensions, seeking a bridge into ours. Every moment we spent in our half-awake states gave it a chance to tighten its grip. Every dream encounter let it reshape our reality. My stomach churned as the walls around us rippled like liquid. The corridor began to tear open to reveal glimpses of a howling void filled with swirling shadows. I felt my sanity straining at the seams. In that moment, the figure radiated a sense of triumph, or something akin to it, and I woke up gasping for air, drenched in sweat. The faint streetlight through my bedroom window seemed painfully bright as I tried to reorient myself. My bedroom walls no longer looked solid. They felt as though they were gently vibrating. The air was thick, leaving me short of breath. When I managed to calm myself enough to leave the room, I found Adam seated on the couch, eyes wide, chest heaving. He appeared half catatonic, but he indicated he'd had the same revelation. The apartment was slowly being replaced by the entity's realm. As the days went on, our sense of linear time began to fracture. I would stumble out of my room, thinking it was morning, only to find the kitchen clock telling me it was well past noon. Sometimes the hallway lights would flicker for what felt like ages, and I'd catch glimpses of swirling darkness outside the windows, where there should have been city lights. My heart never seemed to slow. I lived with a constant drumbeat of anxiety in my chest, my breath shallow and ragged. Sleep provided no relief. It only tethered me closer to the creature's domain. The apartment itself felt like a living thing, each creak in the floor a ragged inhalation, each flicker of light a twitch of some hidden nerve. I could hardly focus on my daily tasks. Even reading a single page of a document for work was monumental, as though the letters were swimming on the paper. My mind would replay the dream corridor whenever I closed my eyes, forcing my heart to race anew. Adam became more reserved, pacing around the living room or hovering near the windows, as if searching for a crack in reality he could escape through. On one particularly tense afternoon, he described an idea he had found on a forum about banishing intruders from dreamscapes. He claimed that if we both entered the dream consciously and forced a breach back to our reality, we might trap the entity on the other side. Though it sounded impossible, the terror eating away at me made me willing to try anything. We prepared that night by staying awake as long as we could. Our plan was to fall asleep around the same time, maintaining a semblance of control. My heart pounded as I lay in bed, listening to every subtle noise. My palms were slick with sweat, and my throat felt parched. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I slipped into that semi-lucid state, where the corridor awaited like a recurring nightmare. There I was again, the flickering lights overhead casting sporadic flashes across the warped walls. Adam stood next to me, or at least a projection of him in this shared dreamscape. Our eyes locked. I could feel my pulse throbbing in my temples, a blend of fear and grim determination. The figure materialized ahead, blending seamlessly with the shadows. It loomed taller than ever, its elongated arms stretching out in a gesture that resembled welcome or entrapment. The air crackled with tension, and every instinct told me to run. Instead, I held my ground, teeth clenched so tightly my jaw ached. I felt the walls vibrating again, threatening to give way to that tumultuous void. The figure lunged forward with dizzying speed, and for a moment, I felt its dark presence inside my mind, a sensation of unimaginable cold. My whole body shuddered, limbs trembling as if numb. I fought to keep my eyes open. Summoning every ounce of will, I visualized the real apartment, the scuffed walls, the chipped paint, the faint smell of detergent in the living room. I forced that reality into focus. Everything trembled violently around us as cracks of light formed in the dream corridor, tearing open sections of the endless hallway. The figure screeched in that leaf-rustling voice, and I felt a sharp pain in my chest, as if my heart were being gripped by icy fingers. The corridor began to collapse inward, and the vacuum-like pull of the void threatened to swallow everything. With a final surge of terror-laced resolve, I yanked myself out of the dream. I awoke in my bed with a strangled gasp. My heart felt like it might burst, each beat pounding against my ribcage. Adrenaline coursed through my veins, leaving me shaky and nauseous. When I finally willed myself to stand, I realized the apartment was eerily still. The oppressive weight in the hallway felt lighter, though not entirely gone. Adam was on the couch, breathing heavily but awake. He managed to convey that he too had wrested himself free at the last moment. Over the following days, the flickering in the apartment subsided. The hallway still gave me a sense of unease, but I no longer glimpsed that towering shadow in the corner of my eye. The oppressive odor faded, replaced once more by the stale yet familiar scent of old paint. I felt as though I had wrested back control over my sanity and my living space, though a lingering paranoia remained. Every minor change in lighting made my heart skip a beat. Every shift in shadow set off alarms in my mind. Sometimes at night I'd wake up sweating, convinced I felt that presence hovering by the door, only to find nothing. The sense of living on the edge never completely disappeared. Even now I question whether we truly forced the entity out, or merely delayed its full arrival. When I stare too long into the dark corners of the apartment, I swear I see faint undulations in the shadows. Adam and I rarely speak of that period. We go about our routines with tense smiles and an unspoken understanding that we share a secret we can't quite articulate. Yet a persistent dread gnaws at me whenever my thoughts drift to that chaotic void we almost fell into. My heart rate quickens, and my chest feels tight at the mere memory. There is a distinct possibility that the entity lingers in the periphery of our dreams, waiting for the right moment to tear a new rift between worlds. The scariest realization is how closely our world aligns with others, how thin the fabric separating us might be. I suspect it watches us from behind the scenes of reality, still searching for that point of entry. Maybe my fight for lucidity in that final confrontation was only a short-lived victory, a temporary patch over a gaping wound. Sometimes, late at night when I'm on the brink of sleep, I catch the faintest echo of that leaf-like rustle. My pulse surges, and my breath hitches in my throat. Even if I reassure myself that it's just my imagination, a part of me can't fully believe it. The best I can manage is to move forward, balancing precariously between skepticism and fear, hoping that I never again see that elongated silhouette filling my doorway. But in those final moments of drifting into slumber, I can't help feeling watched. My body tenses reflexively, remembering how fragile the boundary between dreams and reality can be. And I know deep down that the figure we confronted might still be out there, an interdimensional traveler biding its time, watching from the shadows that exist between our world and its own. The apartment may appear normal for now, but in the silence, when the lights flicker just so, I can sense the echo of that otherworldly presence. It reminds me that once something has found a crack in your reality, it never truly goes away. It simply waits patiently for you to drift off again, or